There is a strange, quiet space that exists at the very edge of human endurance. A place where all of our modern comforts, our safety nets, and our predictable routines are completely stripped away. For most of us, our daily lives are defined by a sense of security. We wake up in our warm beds, we go to work, we buy food at the grocery store, and we assume that the world will continue to make sense. We rarely, if ever, have to contemplate what we would do if our survival was suddenly put on the line. But every once in a while, a single unexpected event can shatter that illusion, thrusting ordinary people into situations so hostile, so extreme, and so terrifying that they seem almost impossible to survive. Today, we are going to explore 3 incredible stories of individuals who were pushed far beyond the limits of physical and mental exhaustion. These are people who found themselves completely alone in some of the most unforgiving environments on our planet, with no help on the way, no food, and absolutely no logical reason to believe they would live to see another day. Yet, in the face of certain death, they did not give up. Instead, they tapped into a deep, primal well of resilience, proving that the human will to survive is one of the most powerful and mysterious forces in existence. Let us begin our journey in the year 1983 on the warm, sun-kissed docks of Tahiti. This is where we meet 23-year-old Tommy Ashcraft. Tommy was a free spirit, a young woman who had fallen in love with the ocean and the ultimate freedom of the sailing lifestyle. She was adventurous, capable, and had spent years learning the complex, demanding art of ocean navigation. It was during her travels that she met 34-year-old Richard Sharp, a seasoned British sailor who shared her deep passion for the sea. The two quickly formed an inseparable bond, united by their shared love of adventure and the open water. They spent more time living on boats than they did on land, dreaming of a future where they would sail around the world together. They were young, they were in love, and they felt entirely invincible. In October of that year, a close friend approached the couple with an incredible opportunity. The friend needed someone to deliver his luxury 44-foot yacht, a vessel named the Hazana, from the tropical waters of Tahiti all the way to San Diego, California. This was a massive undertaking. The journey would cover over 4,000 miles of open, unpredictable ocean. It was a significantly longer and more demanding trip than either Tammy or Richard had ever attempted before. But they were highly confident in their seafaring abilities, and the prospect of spending weeks navigating the deep blue sea together was too exciting to pass up. They gladly accepted the job, packed their gear, and set sail into the vast Pacific. For the first 2 weeks, the voyage was everything they had hoped for. The weather was perfect, the winds were steady, and the Hazana cut through the water with ease. But as they sailed just north of the equator, the ship's weather radio began to crackle with concerning news. A tropical disturbance had formed in the region, and it was rapidly intensifying into a massive hurricane named Raymond. Initially, Tammy and Richard did not panic. They knew that hurricanes in this part of the Pacific often changed direction or weakened before they could cause major damage to a vessel as sturdy as the Hazana. However, they decided that it was still in their best interest to be cautious. They adjusted their sails and altered their course, hoping to sail completely out of the storm's path and find calmer, safer waters. But the ocean had other plans. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Raymond did not weaken. Instead, it grew into a terrifying Category 4 storm, and its path became highly erratic. Every time Tammy and Richard changed direction to get away from the storm, the hurricane seemed to shift with them, speeding up and closing the distance. It felt as if a massive, malevolent force was actively tracking them across the water. Soon, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, the wind began to howl with a deafening roar, and the waves grew into towering, foaming walls of water. They realized they could no longer outrun the storm. They were going to have to weather it. They went to work securing the yacht. They put on their heavy, waterproof rain gear, boarded up the cabin windows with thick wooden panels, and double-checked all the safety lines. When they stood on the deck, looking out at the horizon, the scene was absolutely paralyzing. Tammy would later say that she had never truly understood the absolute terror of a hurricane until she was trapped in one. The waves were 50 feet tall, giant walls of black water that lifted the 44-foot yacht into the air, making it completely airborne before sending it crashing down into the deep troughs below. Each time the boat landed, it felt as though the entire structure would break in half. Immediately after each crash, a massive wave would break over the deck, burying the boat in water and threatening to drag them down into the depths. Richard was at the helm, fighting the steering wheel with all his strength. He was an incredibly skilled sailor, and he managed to find a way to ride the waves, steering the boat at just the right angle to prevent it from capsizing. For hours, they fought the storm in a state of absolute chaos. Eventually, the wind began to die down slightly, and the waves, though still massive, became more predictable. It seemed as though they had made it through the worst of the hurricane and that they would survive. At this point, Tommy was completely exhausted. The sheer physical and mental stress of the battle had left her barely able to stand. Richard, who was anchored to the cockpit by a heavy safety line, noticed her fatigue. He told her to go down into the cabin, get some dry clothes, and try to get some rest. He assured her that he had everything under control. Tammy was incredibly grateful. She opened the heavy cabin doors, stepped inside, and made her way down the steps. But just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard Richard scream from the deck. "Oh my God," he yelled. Before Tommy could even react, a massive rogue wave, a towering wall of water that had been hidden by the darkness, struck the Hazana head-on. The force of the impact was so great that it flipped the entire 44-foot yacht completely upside down in a violent backflip. Inside the cabin, Tammy felt the floor instantly vanish. She was thrown violently across the room, her head slamming hard against a wooden cabinet. She was knocked unconscious instantly, and the world went silent. When Tammy finally woke up, 27 hours had passed. She opened her eyes to a scene of absolute devastation. She was lying on the floor of the cabin, partially submerged in cold water. The space was a disaster area. The force of the capsize had shattered the furniture, throwing heavy tools, wet papers, and navigation charts all over the floor. The boat, after being flipped completely upside down, had somehow been rolled upright again by another wave while she lay unconscious. But Tammy's head was throbbing with a severe concussion, and she could barely comprehend where she was or what had happened. Her mind was in a fog, but her survival instincts immediately took over. She knew she had to find Richard. She dragged herself out of the water, climbed the wet, slippery stairs, and pushed open the cabin doors to step out onto the deck. What she saw was a scene of utter horror. The Hazana was completely ruined. Both of the massive masts had snapped off, and the sails were dragging in the water, acting like heavy anchors that were slowly pulling the boat down. The deck had been stripped bare of all equipment. Tommy began to scream Richard's name, her voice cracking with panic, but there was no answer. She rushed to the cockpit where she had last seen him. And then she saw it. Richard's safety line, which had been securely attached to the boat, was dangling over the side of the yacht. She pulled the line up, and her heart shattered. The heavy metal safety harness had actually broken under the immense force of the wave. Richard was gone. He had been swept into the freezing, empty ocean. He was not wearing a life jacket, having taken it off earlier when the storm had briefly calmed down. Tommy was filled with an overwhelming wave of grief. She wanted to sit down and cry, to mourn the loss of the man she loved. But she knew that if she did, she would die too. The boat was slowly sinking. The engine was dead, the radio was ruined by salt water, and the electronic navigation and emergency beacon systems were completely destroyed. She was entirely alone in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no ships, no land, and no hope of rescue. But Tommy refused to give up. She began to act like a robot, focusing entirely on the physical tasks required to survive. She went below deck and began manually pumping the water out of the cabin. She returned to the deck and, using her knowledge of rigging, managed to build a makeshift mast and sail out of the broken debris. She searched the ruined cabin and found that some of the marine almanacs were still dry. By studying the maps, she identifies a major ocean current that she thought she could get to. Using just a sextant and a watch, she manually navigated this broken-down, leaking ship into this current, steering toward Hawaii, which was about 1,500 miles away. For 41 days, Tammy survived on canned food and peanut butter. She manually navigated her ship using only the sun, the stars, the watch, and her sextant. Every single day was a battle against despair. She knew that if her calculations were off by even a fraction of a degree, she would sail past Hawaii and drift out into the endless open waters of the Pacific, where she would run out of food and water and die. But her calculations were flawless. When Tommy finally stepped foot on land in Hawaii, she was relieved that she had made it, but at the same time, she had this sudden flood of emotions. She was so incredibly sad about the loss of Richard. It was like she really had not had a chance to grieve his loss, because that whole time after the accident, her entire focus had been on survival. Although Tammy would make a full recovery, it would take her 6 years to learn how to read again because of the severe head injury she sustained when the boat capsized. But when she did regain that skill, she finally stopped and she wrote her and Richard's story in a book called Red Sky in Morning, which became an international bestseller and was later converted into a movie called Adrift. Now, let us travel from the deep blue waters of the Pacific to the scorching, barren expanse of the Australian outback. This is a place of extreme heat, red dirt, and deadly silence, an environment where a single mistake can easily cost you your life. Growing up in southeastern Australia, Ricky McGee worked a variety of jobs, including being a carpet salesman, a prawn fisherman, a nightclub doorman, an electrician, and a bailiff. In 2006, when Ricky was 35, he was offered yet another new job in a government department in Western Australia. He accepted the job, hopped in his car, and began the long drive across the desert. While on the extremely desolate Buntine Highway, which is basically a road in the middle of the desert with nothing around, no people, no buildings, nothing, he was driving along and he saw a group of 3 men standing outside of their car. Ricky assumed they must have broken down, so he pulled over to ask if they needed help. They came up to him and were so grateful that he stopped. They told him they had run out of gas and asked if they could hop in with him and ride up to the next town. Ricky said, "Fine, climb on in." The 3 men got into his car, and they took off. After that, Ricky has no memory of what happened. He believes one of them drugged him by putting something in his drink, which was sitting in the center console and was open, but he does not know for sure. Ricky remembers waking up, and he was in a camp. He sat up, unrestrained, and looked out in front of him. The 3 guys who had gotten into the car with him were sitting on rocks looking at him, and one of them had a gun that he was aiming directly at Ricky. Ricky was just looking around, not really sure what was going on, when one of them got up, came over, and offered him water. Ricky took a sip of the water because he was extremely thirsty, and he believes the water was poisoned as well because shortly after taking a sip, he passed out again. When Ricky regained consciousness a second time, he could not move. It was completely dark, and he felt something tugging at his skin. As he lay there, he realized there was black plastic right over his face. He had been buried alive. He then realized there was a wild dingo standing on his chest that had tugged the plastic away from his face because the dog was trying to take a bite out of him. But the dog was actually the one that saved his life by creating an air pocket in the plastic. Ricky screamed at the dog, and the animal panicked, leaping out of the hole and running away. Ricky was able to work his fingers up to this hole, pull it all the way open, and push himself out of the plastic. He realized there was not much dirt or rocks placed over him. They probably thought he would just suffocate in the middle of the desert and no one would find him anyway. He stood up in his grave and looked around. There was no sign of the three men, and his car was gone. They had also taken all of his clothing, even his shoes. He had no food, no water, and he was in the middle of the desert with no roads, no people, and no buildings in sight. Confusion overtook Ricky because he just could not make sense of what had happened to him. Who were these three people? Why did they attack him? Did they just want to steal his car, and were they prepared to kill him just to take it? He sat down in the shade of a small bush and stayed there for several hours, thinking about what to do, but he was not one to let pessimism crowd his psyche. He decided that if he was going to survive, he needed to get up and get moving. After 10 days of just wandering through the desert and seeing absolutely nobody, he came across a fairly large waterhole. He decided that he would have a better chance of surviving if he just waited there until someone came and rescued him, rather than keeping on walking through the desert where he was bound to eventually collapse and die. So, he made a makeshift shelter next to the waterhole and began to wait. After almost a week of being at this spot, Ricky had still not had a single thing to eat since his ordeal began. His stomach was in knots, he was in extreme pain, and he was starving. Just then, a lizard happened to run across the ground in front of him. Without even thinking, he reached out, grabbed it, and took a bite out of it. It was like a primal side of him was suddenly unleashed, and he had no issues eating anything that moved. For weeks, Ricky stayed at this spot, drinking from the water hole and eating lizards, frogs, leeches, snakes, grasshoppers, and caterpillars. Basically, anything that moved anywhere near his camp, he would chase it down and eat it. He actually developed an affinity for certain frogs over others, and he said that in terms of eating leeches, they were okay, but you needed to eat them really quickly, otherwise they would attach to the inside of your mouth. He also ate plants, though he had no idea what was harmful and what was safe. He just ate what tasted good and got lucky. But as much as Ricky was eating, it was not enough. He was slowly losing his battle with the desert, and he was starving to death. He believed he did not have enough time to just continue waiting at this particular spot, and that he needed to go out and find help. So, he left the waterhole and began stumbling through the desert all over again. But he was so weak that he only lasted for a couple of days before he found another waterhole. He stopped there and built yet another shelter, this time believing it would become his tomb. Over the next couple of days, wild dogs began coming to his camp and circling his shelter. It was like they knew he was about to die soon, or they at least knew he was weak enough that they could probably overpower him. At night, Ricky had to barricade the door of his shelter because the dogs would get aggressive, coming up to the door and trying to paw their way inside. On the 70th day of his ordeal, Ricky believed he was probably within a day or two of passing away, so he put a makeshift cross on the outside of his shelter. He believed this place would be his tomb, and he wanted someone to notice the cross, find his body, and let his family know what had happened to him. But on the 71st day, when Ricky happened to be standing outside of his shelter, two ranch hands who were way off the road in the outback happened to look in his direction, and they saw him. When they went over to him, they said he looked like a walking skeleton. Ricky practically collapsed as soon as he saw help had finally arrived. The ranch hands evacuated Ricky from the desert and brought him to a hospital where he weighed less than 100 pounds. At the beginning of his ordeal, he had weighed over 230 pounds. Despite filing a detailed report with the police about the three men who attacked him, they were never caught. Ricky checked himself out of the hospital after 6 days and made a full recovery. He ended up writing a book about his experience, and he now works construction in Dubai. Now, let us turn our attention to our final story, which takes us from the hot sands of Australia to the freezing vertical world of the Peruvian Andes. This is a place where the air is thin, the cold is bone-chilling, and a single misstep can send you falling thousands of feet to your death. By 1985, the remote and extremely dangerous west face of the Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes was still unclimbed. But in 1985, two very ambitious climbers, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates, decided they were going to be the first to conquer it. By all accounts, they seemed up for the job, having already conquered numerous difficult Scottish ice cliffs, as well as a number of large mountain faces in the Alps. So, in early June of that year, the pair flew to Peru and arrived at the base camp nearest to the Ciula Grande. It was still 5 miles away, so they could not actually see the face they were going to climb yet. On June 5th, when the weather was good enough, the pair left camp and worked their way around the huge lake and across the glacier to the base of this massive cliff. When they saw it for the first time, they could not believe how steep and dangerous it looked. But over the next 3 days, they managed to make it up this cliff despite a blizzard hitting them halfway through, and they reached the summit. To them, this was a crowning achievement. They had done it, and they had written their names in the history books. But in reality, the thing that people would remember them for was not for reaching the top of Ciula Grande, it was for what happened when they started going down. Because of how steep this mountain was, and because of the blizzard that was not going away, but was actually getting worse, the descent was going to be much more challenging than the ascent. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the morning of June 8th, Joe and Simon left the summit and began very carefully making their way down the mountain. At 11 o'clock, disaster struck. Joe lost his footing and fell to the bottom of an ice cliff, shattering his leg. Initially, they both assumed this was a death sentence for Joe. There was no way he could climb down the mountain, and certainly Simon could not carry him down. They were so high up, and it was so steep that it seemed impossible. But Simon wanted to at least try to save his friend. He climbed down to him, gave him some mild painkillers that he had, and then he attached his rope to Joe. Simon anchored himself in the snow and began lowering Joe down the mountain, using all 300 feet of his rope. When he would stop, Joe would anchor himself in the snow with his ice picks, and then Simon would climb down to Joe and repeat the process over and over again, lowering him 300 feet at a time. This went on for hours and hours of back-breaking work for Simon. Joe, meanwhile, was in excruciating pain from his broken leg. To make matters worse, the storm had gotten so bad that the visibility between them was zero. As Simon was lowering Joe, he could not see what he was lowering Joe onto. But they had no other choice. That was the only way they could get him down. At 5 o'clock that night, Simon accidentally lowered Joe over a cliff. As soon as Joe was hanging off the edge, all of his weight was on the rope, and suddenly the rope was flying out of Simon's hands. Simon managed to stop him from careening over the edge, but now Simon was the only thing holding Joe from tumbling to his death, and Simon was being slowly dragged down the mountain. He could not anchor himself in, and they were in the middle of this inhospitable environment in the middle of the night. A storm was raging, it was freezing cold, and they could not communicate with each other. They could not hear each other or see each other. Simon was just hoping that Joe would be able to grab onto something and take his weight off the rope, otherwise this was going to end badly for both of them. But unfortunately, the cliff was at an angle, so Joe was dangling in midair and could not touch the wall. He had nothing to grab onto, and he was just dangling in the air. As Simon tried to move the rope to signal to Joe to take his weight off the rope, Joe was trying to climb up the rope, but his hands were starting to get frostbitten. He was weak, he was in pain, and he could not do anything about it. For the next 2.5 hours, Simon was desperately trying to regain an anchor in the snow, but every second that went by, he was getting pulled farther and farther down the mountain. He could not see how close he was to the edge, but he knew he was getting close. Finally, at 7:30 that night, with no other option, Simon pulled out a knife and cut the rope. As soon as the rope was cut, Simon fell backward. He was safe, and nothing was pulling him off the cliff any longer. But he knew he had just sent Joe to his death. Except Joe did not die. When that rope was cut, he fell 150 feet and smashed into the ground, but what he hit was a thin sheet of ice that broke from his weight, and he fell another 80 feet into a massive ice crevasse. Joe was knocked unconscious from the fall, but when he woke up, he was laying on his side. He opened his eyes, freezing, looked around, and could not believe he was alive. He did not know where he was, as it was totally dark. He turned on his headlamp and realized he had fallen into an ice crevasse. He looked down and saw he was on a little ledge that was overlooking a much deeper fall. The crevasse seemed to go on infinitely into a black chasm, and he realized that had he fallen even a foot to the side, that is where he would have gone. It was a miracle he was alive. But now he was trapped in the middle of an ice crevasse 80 feet down. He could not go down, and he could not go up. At the time, Joe did not know if Simon had fallen off the cliff with him or if he had cut the rope, but the rope was still attached to his waist and it fed up and out of the crevasse. He grabbed it and pulled on it until it all came tumbling back down and he saw it was frayed. Sure enough, Simon had cut the rope. Even though Joe was not mad at Simon for the decision he made, because he understood it was the right one, Joe still became very emotional when he saw this. He felt so completely alone, and he was so sad. For a little while, he just kind of freaked out, screaming and crying, not knowing what he was going to do. After that, he sat down, knowing he was not getting out of there, and that he was going to die a slow, horrible, painful death. Joe remembers reaching up and turning off his headlamp, which retrospectively he thought was kind of goofy because he was about to die inside of this crevasse and he was saving batteries. But with the light off, he sat on the ledge and heard all the sounds coming from inside the crevasse. It was this awful, grinding, moaning sound. He said it was so terrifying sitting in the darkness listening to that sound that he reached up and turned his light back on just for comfort. Back up on the mountain, Simon was devastated. He felt like he had just killed his friend, and even though he understood why he did it, it did not change the fact that he felt incredibly guilty. That night, he did not even move from his position. He dug a little snow cave, laid down, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning when he got up, he began moving his way down the mountain. He finally rounded the area where Joe had been hanging off that cliff, and he got a chance to look down and see where Joe might have wound up. To his horror, he saw this massive opening to a crevasse that seemed almost bottomless, confirming that Joe had definitely died. Nonetheless, Simon went down to the edge of the crevasse and yelled for Joe, screaming for him to call out if he was still alive. But he never heard anything back, and with a heavy heart, Simon turned around and started heading back to base camp. A little while after Simon had left, Joe finally woke up. He had been asleep when Simon was yelling down for him. Joe wakes up, realizes this was not a bad dream, and starts yelling for Simon, but after a while he realized Simon was not coming back. Simon thought he was dead already. At this point, Joe decides he needs to try to climb out of the crevasse, even with a broken leg. He gets his ice picks and starts making his way up the ice wall, but he cannot put any weight on his broken leg, and he keeps falling down. He realized he could not climb this wall, probably not even with two good legs. So Joe had two choices. He could wait on the ledge and hope to be rescued, but by his calculations, it was highly unlikely anyone would come. Or he could go down deeper into the crevasse, having no idea where it goes, hoping that somewhere down in that black void, there was an opening that led back out to the outside of the mountain. He made his choice. He screwed an anchor into the ice, put his rope through it, tested it, and looked down into the void one last time. He knew that as soon as he stepped off this ledge, he could not come back up. This was a one-way trip, and if he made it to the bottom of his rope and did not find a ledge or a tunnel, he would fall to his death. On purpose, he did not put a knot at the end of his rope, figuring either he would find a way out or he would not, but at least it would be quick. Down he went, about 80 feet into this pitch-black crevasse. He got to a point where the walls came together, and he was able to squeeze through. Once he got through that point, it was like the center of an hourglass, where below it, the space opened up. As soon as he pushed through, he could actually see the ground. He saw flat ground, and there was light shining on it, which meant there was a hole leading out to the mountain. He went all the way down, touched the bottom, and disconnected from his rope. He climbed his way up an incline to where the sun was coming in, which was a hole leading right back out onto the mountain. He crawled out, tumbled onto the snow, and remembered just laying on the mountain, looking at the sun and laughing. He could not believe it. But after the initial relief wore off, he realized he was not out of the woods yet. He still needed to climb down the rest of the mountain, and after that, he had to navigate 5 miles back to base camp. Over several delirious, painful, and miserable days, he managed to crawl all the way back to base camp. He got there right as Simon was packing up the tent and getting ready to leave. Simon could not believe he was looking at Joe alive. He just endlessly swore, unable to speak, feeling like he was looking at a ghost. But after that initial shock, Simon just gave Joe a massive hug, and they both cried and held each other. Joe underwent 6 surgical operations to repair the damage to his leg, and doctors told him he would never climb again, but after 2 years of intense rehabilitation, he was not only walking fine, but he was mountain climbing again. As for Simon, he managed to leave the mountain without serious physical injury, but he carried an enormous sense of guilt. Joe consistently states in every interview that Simon made the right decision, and that he is not at fault. Joe wrote a book about the experience called Touching the Void, which sold millions of copies worldwide and was adapted into a major motion picture. Today, they have drifted apart over the years, but they still consider each other friends. These 3 stories, though taking place in completely different corners of the world, all share a profound and deeply moving truth. They remind us that within every human being, there is a powerful primal drive to survive that can overcome the most impossible circumstances. When Tommy Ashcraft was lost at sea, when Ricky McGee was buried alive in the desert, and when Joe Simpson was trapped in the freezing depths of a crevasse, they all faced moments of absolute despair. They had every reason to give up, to let go, and to accept their fate. But they chose to fight. They chose to take one more step, to make one more calculation, to crawl one more mile. And in doing so, they proved that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments of our lives, the human spirit has the capacity to find a way back to the light. Their journeys leave us with a haunting and beautiful reminder of just how precious and how incredibly resilient human life truly is. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Early on the evening of Sunday, the 27th of November, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods was leaning towards the mirror in her small New York City apartment. She was carefully applying her eyeliner, her hands steady, a skill she'd perfected over countless nights just like this one. Her phone, sitting on the bathroom counter next to her makeup, buzzed. She heard it, but she didn't even glance over to see who was calling. She just didn't have the time. Her shift started at 7, and she couldn't afford to be late. Catherine had moved to the city from Ohio 3 years earlier. She had that big, bright dream that pulls so many people to New York. She wanted to be a dancer on Broadway. She imagined her name in lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of being on stage under the hot theatrical lights. But New York City is an expensive place to have a dream. Just existing here costs a fortune. So, in between chasing that Broadway dream, she was working. A lot. She actually had 3 different jobs just to keep her head above water, to pay the rent, and to afford the lessons she needed to even have a shot at her dream. 2 of her jobs were pretty normal. She was a waitress at a busy diner, where she was quick on her feet and had a friendly smile that earned her good tips. She also taught dance classes to little kids, their energy and enthusiasm a welcome contrast to the cynicism of the city. She loved seeing their faces light up when they nailed a new step. But tonight, she was getting ready for her third job. And this job was different. It wasn't something she talked about. In fact, she was deeply embarrassed by it, and she kept it a secret from almost everyone she knew, especially her family back in Ohio. Her third job was at a place near Times Square called Flash Dancers. She was a topless dancer. Catherine really, truly hated the work. The leering eyes, the fake smiles she had to put on, the way it made her feel. But the money was good. It was really good. And that money was the fuel for her dream. It paid for the expensive voice lessons and the advanced dance classes that were essential if she was ever going to make it to Broadway. She lived in Manhattan, the most expensive borough in an already incredibly expensive city. She knew she could save a lot of money if she moved to a cheaper neighborhood in a different borough like Queens or Brooklyn. And when she had first arrived in New York, that's exactly what she'd done. She'd found a small place in a less expensive area, thinking she was being smart and practical. But that practicality had come at a terrifying cost. Her landlord there had sexually assaulted her. The experience was so traumatic, so violating, that it nearly broke her. For a while, she seriously considered just giving up, packing her bags, and moving back home to Ohio, leaving the city and her dream behind forever. It felt like the city itself had chewed her up and spit her out. But in the end, after a lot of soul-searching, she decided to stay. She was a fighter. She wasn't going to let one horrible man destroy everything she had worked for. But she did make a change. She moved. She found her current apartment in a much safer part of Manhattan, where she felt she could walk down the street at night without constantly looking over her shoulder. To help with the much higher rent, she got a roommate. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was a familiar face from back home in Ohio, a little piece of her old life in this new, overwhelming city. At this very moment, as Catherine was finishing her makeup, David wasn't in the apartment. He'd gone downstairs a few minutes ago to get his car, which was parked a few blocks away. He was going to drive her to her shift at the club. Catherine finished with her eyeliner, satisfied with the clean, sharp line. She left the bathroom and walked through the small living room. On the floor, a black dog was sleeping soundly. She had to step carefully over it. The dog wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter. It was one of the many side jobs he juggled to make ends meet, just like her. This particular dog was just staying with them for a few days while its owners were out of town. When David wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a fancy hotel just up the street from their apartment building. Catherine and David had a history that was a bit complicated. They had actually been a couple at one point. They dated for a little while after he followed her to New York. But these days, they were just friends, just roommates, splitting the bills to survive in the city. Although, if Catherine was being honest with herself, she sometimes wondered if they should give it another shot. Just a few days ago had been Thanksgiving. Instead of making the long trip back to Ohio like she usually did, she had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. Just the two of them. And it had been really nice. It felt comfortable, easy, like coming home. A big part of what she appreciated about him was that he knew about her job at Flash Dancers. He was one of the very few people who did, and he didn't judge her for it. He understood why she was doing it, and that lack of judgment was a rare and precious thing. But there was one major hurdle she could see if they were to ever get back together. It was David's attitude towards other men in her life. He seemed to dislike basically every single man she ever met or dated. It didn't matter who they were. He just had this immediate, almost instinctual distrust of them. Now, with some of the guys, she could kind of see his point. There was a guy named Joe she had dated for a short time. She had met him at the strip club. He was a customer. David had been very clear that he thought Joe was bad news. And in hindsight, he was probably right. But then there were other guys, like Paul. Paul was a personal trainer at her gym. She'd gone on a few dates with him, but it was nothing serious. They were more like friends who spoke on the phone every now and then. Paul had always been perfectly nice to David, polite and friendly whenever he saw him. But David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just had a bad feeling about him. For now, though, Catherine pushed those thoughts aside. She didn't have time to sort out her entire romantic life. She just needed to get dressed and get downstairs before David started wondering where she was. She went into her bedroom, and that's when she heard it. The dog in the living room suddenly started barking. It wasn't a playful bark. It was sharp, insistent, like it was barking at something or someone. Curious, Catherine walked out of her bedroom to see what was going on. A little while later, David Hahn was walking quickly along the sidewalk, his breath misting in the cool November air. He was heading to his car, parked several blocks away from the apartment. He was already feeling a bit rushed. He finally reached the car, jumped in, and started the engine. He drove back towards his building, navigating the busy Sunday evening traffic. As he pulled up to the curb in front of his apartment, he took out his phone and called Catherine. He expected her to answer right away, to say she was on her way down. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was odd. He tried again. Voicemail again? He sighed, a little annoyed, and put his hazard lights on. He got out of the car and headed into the building to go get her. He took the stairs 2 at a time up to the second floor. As he turned down the hallway towards his apartment, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, standing right in the middle of the shared hallway, was the black dog he was supposed to be dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment. David just stared for a second, totally confused. Then he realized there was someone else there. His neighbor, a man named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. Brad was holding a leash, and it was clipped onto the dog's collar. Brad looked a bit surprised to see David, and David was just trying to process what was happening. Why did his neighbor have the dog on a leash in the hallway? Brad spoke first. He explained that he'd been coming up the stairs and had found the dog just wandering around by itself. He said he recognized it as David's dog, so he'd brought it back to their door. Brad said he had just knocked, but nobody had answered. At this point, David understood why Brad had the dog, but the bigger question was still unanswered. How did the dog get out in the first place? He didn't ask, though. He just thanked Brad, took the leash, and stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The door was closed, but when he tried the handle, he found that it was unlocked. He couldn't remember if he'd left it unlocked when he went to get the car. It wasn't something he would normally do. He pushed the door open and called out Catherine's name. There was no answer. Just silence. And that was really weird. She should have been right there, waiting for him. He stepped inside, the dog trailing behind him. He didn't see Catherine in the living room, but he did see that the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. He walked over to it and called her name again. Catherine, we're going to be late. Still nothing. He pushed on her door, expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. It moved maybe a few inches and then stopped hard. He could feel resistance from the other side, like something heavy was on the floor blocking the door from opening. And now, with all these strange little things piling up the dog in the hall, the unlocked door, the silence, the blocked bedroom door, a feeling of serious worry started to wash over him. A surge of adrenaline hit him, and he put his shoulder into the door and shoved it hard. It flew open. He stuck his head inside to see what was blocking it, and when his eyes adjusted to the light, what he saw made him recoil instantly. He pulled back, stumbled out of the room, ran back into the hallway, fumbling for his phone, and called the police. About a half an hour later, around 7:30 in the evening, an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up the stairs of an apartment building in a nice part of Manhattan. This area was known for being extremely safe. Murders just didn't really happen here. But if the 911 call he'd just heard was accurate, he knew a potentially grisly murder scene was waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he got to the second-floor landing, he saw that a few other uniformed NYPD officers were already on the scene. One of them was talking to a young, skinny guy who was standing in the hallway looking completely distraught. The young man was holding a leash, and at the end of it was a black dog that was sitting quietly at his feet. Another officer saw Getz arrive and walked over to brief him. He said the man being interviewed was the victim's roommate, David Hahn. He was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment, in the back bedroom. Getz nodded, his face grim, and walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the open door of the apartment. His plan was always the same. He wanted to see the scene for himself before he started questioning anyone. Getz pulled on a pair of disposable rubber gloves and began his initial assessment. He carefully examined the doorframe of the apartment and then the door itself. He was looking for any signs of a break-in, any splintered wood or scratch marks around the lock. He saw nothing. No damage at all. That told him something important right away. Whoever did this either had a key or was let inside. He stepped into the apartment. The small living room was a little bit messy, but it was a lived-in messy, not a violent messy. The futon was pulled out into a bed, and there were some men's clothes strewn about. It just looked like a typical New York City apartment shared by young people. Getz moved slowly through the living room, taking care not to disturb anything. He headed towards the back of the apartment, towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was located. The door to the room was open just wide enough for him to slip through. When he stepped inside, the scene changed dramatically. There was blood everywhere. It was spattered on the walls, on the furniture. The room itself looked like a tornado had gone through it. It had been completely torn apart. A dresser drawer was hanging open, and women's clothing was scattered all over the floor. The mattress had been ripped completely off the bed frame and was now lying crookedly on the floor. That's what had been blocking the door from opening. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, in a large pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. On the front of her t-shirt, he saw a very clear, distinct shoe print. It looked as if her killer had literally stepped on her chest during or after the attack. There were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. He also saw what he immediately recognized as defensive wounds on her hands and her forearms, little cuts and slices that told him she had fought back hard against her attacker. She had fought for her life. But the worst of her injuries were to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat with such savage force that they had nearly decapitated her. To Detective Getz, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was an attack fueled by an absolute, uncontrollable rage. At that moment, Getz heard footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. The blocked door was making it difficult for people to move in and out of the bedroom, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to carefully pick up the mattress from the floor. They leaned it up against the wall, out of the way, so the bedroom door could now swing open freely. With the team now able to access the room properly, Detective Getz stepped back and let them do their work. He watched as they meticulously documented everything. He saw them carefully lift the shoe print from the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. Then they found a second, identical shoe print on her bedsheets, and they collected that one as well. To Getz, both of these prints looked like they came from the exact same shoe. And just by looking at them, he could tell they were made by a man's shoe, probably an average size. This immediately made Detective Getz curious about something. He stepped out of the bedroom and back into the living room. He quickly found a couple of pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor near the futon. He picked one up and looked at the sole. While the tread pattern didn't match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, the size looked about right. They appeared to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 that night, Detective Getz sat down at a metal table inside an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. He slid a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim. And, at that moment, Detective Getz's number one suspect. The facts were simple and damning. There was no sign of forced entry at the apartment, which meant Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was led inside by someone who did. The murder weapon was a knife, and the sheer brutality of the attack screamed personal motivation. It felt like a crime of passion. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been completely trashed, nothing of value seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, a sexual motive was also a strong possibility. So Getz's working theory was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well, had easy access to her home, and possibly had a romantic or sexual connection to her. David Hahn fit that profile perfectly. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and took out his notepad, he did a quick, subtle scan of David's hands and forearms. He saw no visible cuts, no scrapes, no bruises. That was a little strange. Getz figured that a fight as violent as the one Catherine had put up would have almost certainly left a mark on her attacker. But he didn't mention this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward, his expression sympathetic, and asked David to walk him through everything that had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a little as he reached for the water bottle. He took a deep breath to try and calm his nerves. He said he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40. That's when he left to go get his car so he could drive her to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But, he said, getting his car had taken longer than he expected. On the way, he had run into a couple of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them for a few minutes. He said that after he finally got his car and drove back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting for him out on the curb. But when he got there, she was nowhere in sight. She didn't answer her phone when he called, so he'd gone inside and run upstairs. In the hallway, he said, he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was for some reason holding the leash of the dog David was supposed to be watching. Then David said he went into the apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. He said he called 911 immediately and that it was right around 7 o'clock. As David said this, Getz stopped writing on his notepad and just looked up at him. He could not believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he was only out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and in that tiny window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered, and her killer had managed to escape without anyone seeing them. It was, honestly, one of the weakest alibis Getz had ever heard in his career. But he didn't let his skepticism show. He didn't want David to know just how close he was to being arrested, because he didn't want David to shut down and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very calm and understanding as he asked how long David had known Catherine. David explained that they had met a few years ago back in Ohio while Catherine was home visiting family. They started dating, and he eventually decided to move to New York to be with her. But not long after he arrived, Catherine broke up with him, and she had asked him to move out of the apartment. David said he hadn't been able to afford a place of his own, so he had started sleeping in his car. He said Catherine had felt bad about that, and so she had eventually let him move back in, but on one condition, that he slept on the futon in the living room and that they were just roommates. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page. This new information was a bombshell. David wasn't just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. A spurned ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see her alive and the first person to find her body. Getz was now more confident than ever that he was sitting across the table from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but he said he needed to go check on something really quick. David agreed to wait. As Getz stood up to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back. He asked David one last, seemingly casual question. He asked him what his shoe size was. Without a moment's hesitation, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down on his notepad, and then he left the room. What he didn't tell David was that the reason he was stepping out was to get some crucial updates from the forensics team and from the uniformed officers who were, at that very moment, questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to come back and use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, around 3 in the afternoon the next day, Detective Getz was sitting at his desk, feeling completely exhausted. He was pounding yet another cup of bitter office coffee. He had been up all night long interrogating David, who was still, at that very moment, sitting in an interrogation room just down the hall. Getz had also been going back and forth with his team, getting updates from forensics and from officers out in the field, and he still had a mountain of paperwork to get through before he could even think about going home to sleep. Right now, he was going over a new batch of reports from the officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking all the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And just as Getz had suspected, the information they were getting was starting to poke holes in David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 and that at that time, Catherine was perfectly fine. But 2 different neighbors reported hearing screams coming from that apartment well before 6:40. The man who lived in the unit directly above them said he had heard 3 distinct screams at exactly 6:28. And the people who lived in the apartment right next door to them said they'd heard screaming, a dog barking, and the sound of furniture being moved around even earlier, sometime between 5:45 and 6 o'clock. Now, none of these neighbors had called the police or done anything about the noises because the sounds had stopped pretty quickly. In a crowded New York City apartment building, strange noises were a part of life. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had found the dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had insisted that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 o'clock, a full half-hour later. Now, Getz knew from experience that witnesses were often unreliable when it came to specific times. And in a dense building, it was easy to get noises from different apartments confused. But still, all of these inconsistencies were adding up. It was looking more and more like David's alibi had serious problems. The detective sat back in his chair, took another sip of coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up. It was the forensics team, and they had an update on those shoe prints from the crime scene. They had confirmed that the prints on Catherine's t-shirt and on the bedsheets were indeed left by a man's shoe. They were a men's size, 10.5. This was the exact size David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room for another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer him a bottle of water. He just sat down, looked David straight in the eye, and confronted him with all the new evidence. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his size. He told him that his neighbors had heard screams coming from his apartment long before he claimed to have left the building. And he told him that Brad Stewart said he'd seen him in the hallway at least half an hour earlier than David had claimed. Getz then leaned in close and played his trump card. He told David that there were security cameras in the apartment building and that his officers were in the process of getting the footage right now. So, if David had anything to confess, he had better do it now, before the cameras proved he was lying. Getz watched as David's expression shifted from exhaustion to pure, raw fear. It seemed like this was the first time that David was truly realizing that the police did not believe his story for a second. After a moment of stunned silence, David insisted, his voice cracking, that he had not killed Catherine. He begged Getz to believe him. But when the detective just glared back at him, his face a mask of stone, David launched into a brand new story. It was a story he had not mentioned at all in the nearly 20 hours he had been interrogated. David said that Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. He said she had dated him for a while, but that David had always thought he was a creep. David said Catherine had even told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said, the police really needed to go investigate Paul, not him. To Detective Getz, this sounded like a desperate last-ditch effort from a guilty man trying to cast suspicion on someone, anyone else. But he also knew that he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So he wrote down Paul's name and told David they would look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room. And outside on the steps of the precinct, reporters from all the major newspapers were beginning to gather their cameras at the ready. The following morning, The story of Catherine's murder was everywhere. Pictures of her smiling face were on the front page of every paper in the city. The headline on the New York Daily News made Detective Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." The article inside reported that Catherine's family back in Ohio hadn't even known she was working as a topless dancer until they flew to New York to identify her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers were determined to run with that angle. A media circus was the last thing he needed. His team was already under immense pressure to make an arrest, and now they were going to be flooded with tips from the public, most of which would be useless. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to an interrogation room. He had ended the day yesterday feeling pretty sure that David was his killer. He had finally sent David home, but with strict instructions not to leave the city. He fully intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, he had to do his due diligence. He had to follow up on the other leads he had, if only to definitively rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now, waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man David had named. Officers had tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The man who was supposedly obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was subtly look down at Paul's shoes. He could see they were a pretty typical size, maybe a 10 or an 11. At a glance, they could easily be a 10.5. Getz also looked for any scratches or bruises on Paul's hands and arms. And he did see one small injury, a little cut on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked him about it. Paul explained calmly that his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym where he worked as a trainer. Paul was very calm, very soft-spoken. He said he had heard about Catherine's death in the news, and he was devastated. He just wanted to help the investigation in any way he could. When Getz told him that they had gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes. He said that David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had been dating on and off ever since. He said that at the time of Catherine's death, they were in an off phase, but he still cared about her deeply and had hoped that one day they might get back together for good. Paul told Getz that he hadn't seen Catherine in person on the day she died, but he had spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon. He said this wasn't unusual. They still talked on the phone from time to time, even when they weren't officially together. Paul said he had actually tried to call her a second time later that day, but she didn't answer. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Then Paul laid out his alibi for that night. He said he had gone shopping with some friends, and then later he went to a local bar to watch the Jets game, which started around 8:30. Getz made a note to check Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might want to kill Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes seemed to light up, as if he'd just remembered something important. He said there was this other guy, a kind of stalker named Joe. He had been one of Catherine's regular customers at the strip club. He said that months ago, this guy Joe had somehow gotten Catherine's personal phone number and had started contacting her outside of the club. Paul said that around that same time, Catherine had been drugged at work. Someone had slipped a roofie, the date rape drug, into her drink during one of her shifts. Paul said that even though he could never prove it, he had always suspected that it was Joe who had drugged her. He said Catherine had eventually cut off all contact with Joe, but the whole incident had really bothered Paul. It bothered him so much that he had tried to convince Catherine to quit her job at the club, but she had refused. Paul even admitted that he had gone so far as to call Catherine's father in Ohio to tell him how worried he was about her. He said Catherine had been furious with him for doing that and had stopped talking to him for weeks. Getz jotted all of this down. Then he asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but he was sure it was in Catherine's phone. Because he said the very last time he spoke to Catherine on the phone, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that had really surprised him. She said that after months and months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. At this, Getz studied Paul's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. This whole story about Joe could just be a clever way for Paul to deflect suspicion from himself. But Paul seemed sincere. It didn't feel like he was making it up. And besides, it would be simple enough to verify his story by checking Catherine's phone records. Detective Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of the customers from Catherine's secret life at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling deeply annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been another call from another reporter demanding an update on the case. But Getz had no updates to give. He hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. For now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he had subpoenaed the day before. And they showed that Paul Cortez had been telling the truth. The records confirmed that both Paul and a man named Joe had called Catherine shortly before she was killed. So, Getz had his officers track down Joe and bring him in for an interview. He asked Joe to explain why, after months of no contact, he had suddenly decided to call Catherine on the very day she was murdered. Joe claimed he was just calling to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He insisted he was just trying to be friendly. But then, Getz asked Joe point blank if he had ever put a roofie in anyone's drink. At this question, Joe's eyes went wide. He started to stammer and sputter, and he swore that he would never, ever dream of doing something like that. But based on Joe's panicked reaction, Getz had a strong feeling that he was lying. And so now, the entire investigation felt like it was wide open again. Just a few days ago, Getz had been absolutely certain that David Hahn was the killer. But now, all these other men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually starting to look more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers from the hotel, and they confirmed his story. They said he really had stopped to talk with them on the street on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would definitively prove David was lying about his timeline, it actually did the opposite. The footage showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38, which lined up perfectly with his story that he left around 6:40. Now, this didn't completely exonerate him. Based on what the neighbors had heard, Catherine could have been killed before he left. But there weren't many cameras in the old building, and there was no camera covering the second-floor hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another who, if anyone, had gone into that apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang again. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter. But this time, he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and he could hear the excitement in their voice. They told Getz that they had just discovered something big, something they had completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics tech explained that when they had first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was blocking the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they had done that, the mattress had accidentally covered up a crucial piece of evidence that was on the wall the whole time. It was a bloody handprint. It wasn't until a couple of days later, after they had carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they finally moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they saw it. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news. This was the break he had been waiting for. Now he thought all he had to do was go get handprints from all 3 of his suspects and see which one matched. It seemed like it would be that simple. But he quickly realized he had a major problem. By this point, some of his suspects had already gotten lawyers. And their lawyers were advising them not to speak with the police anymore, let alone voluntarily hand over their handprints. And Getz couldn't legally force them to give their prints unless he arrested them first. And so, Detective Getz found himself in a frustrating catch, 2-2. He needed the suspect's handprint in order to make an arrest, but he couldn't get the handprint unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation stalled. Weeks went by. Detective Getz grew more and more frustrated because there was nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. Meanwhile, the case was still getting a ton of coverage in the press. And to the public, it looked like the NYPD was just dropping the ball. But then, on December 16th, 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the very news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of a New York newspaper. And what this woman told them led Detective Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on all the forensic evidence and the numerous interviews police conducted, this is what they believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of the 27th of November, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 in the evening, the killer climbed the stairs inside Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she would be alone in the apartment, getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. The fact that she worked there, that she had this secret life, bothered the killer more than they ever let on. The thought of Catherine dancing for other men, giving her attention to other men, filled the killer with a jealous rage they could barely contain. The killer had tried to win her over, had tried to talk her into being with them exclusively, but she had rejected him. So, in the killer's mind, the time for talking was over. And so, the killer walked quietly up to the door of apartment 2D. They reached down and turned the handle. It was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer pulled out the knife that they had hidden inside their sweatshirt. But then, something they had not planned for happened. The black dog that was lying on the apartment floor jumped up and began to bark at them. For a split second, the killer thought about just turning around and leaving, abandoning the plan. But then, Catherine, alerted by the dog's barking, came out of her bedroom. She looked right at the killer, and she saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and turned and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off-limits to the killer in the past. And just the thought of that, of her trying to keep him out of her space, sent a surge of pure anger through them. The killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, trying to lift up the heavy mattress to use it as a shield. But the killer was too strong and too fast. They forced their way past the mattress and grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine was a fighter. She fought back with everything she had. She began thrashing and kicking, scratching and biting, doing anything she could to break free. But she couldn't. They struggled wildly around the small room, smashing into furniture, knocking things over. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up the knife they had brought and slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with that fatal wound, Catherine kept fighting. She fought with such viciousness that the killer actually had to brace themselves against the wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos of that struggle, the killer didn't even realize that as they steadied themselves, they had placed their bloody hand flat against the wall, leaving a perfect print behind. Finally, Catherine fell to the floor. But the killer was still blinded by rage. They got down on the floor with her and began stabbing her over and over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that the black dog that had barked at them had gotten out of the apartment during the chaos. Now, the killer wanted the dog to be back inside the apartment, but the dog was on edge, still barking at them. So instead, the killer just pulled the apartment door shut, trapping the dog out in the hallway. And then the killer fled the building, using a back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught. Until their violent past finally came back to haunt them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who had no connection to Catherine at all was walking down a street in New York City when she glanced over at a newsstand. And on the cover of one of the newspapers, a picture was plastered across the front page. It was a picture of a man who was currently a person of interest in a high-profile murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this man, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had been too scared and ashamed to ever file a police report. But now, seeing his face in the paper, Seeing that this horrible person was being investigated for murder, she knew she had to speak up. She called the NYPD and she told them everything she knew. The NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's brave testimony as the basis to arrest the killer for the previous assault. And finally, once he was under arrest, Detective Getz was legally able to get his handprint. And those prints were a perfect match to the bloody handprint found on Catherine's bedroom wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions about Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep, a violent predator who had assaulted at least one other woman before he murdered Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell phone towers would later prove that Paul was in the immediate vicinity of Catherine's apartment building right before her murder. The records also showed he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited. He watched until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car. And then he hustled upstairs, knowing that Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for about 20 minutes, it was more than enough time for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine in a jealous rage, and slip away completely unnoticed. Paul Cortez was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, the 23rd of December, 2005. He was later found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And just like that, the truth finally came to light. But the haunting question remains, how many stories like this are still unresolved, hidden from view? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're not ready to stop here, there's still so much waiting for you in the next episode. See you next time. Around 6:30 inches the evening on the 10th of December, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a small guard shack at the Kenotok copper mine in northern Utah. He had a college textbook open in front of him, trying to study. The shack he was in was tiny, barely big enough for one person, with windows on all four sides. And when Brian looked out of those windows, all he saw was darkness. The sun had set a while ago, and this part of the mine was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no other buildings nearby. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the fresh snow on the ground, which made everything outside look kind of eerie and desolate. Brian had been a security guard at this mine for just over a year, but he'd only been assigned to this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. And in his opinion, it was the absolute worst post he could have possibly gotten. His job was to stand guard at a chain-link gate that blocked off a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was such an out-of-the-way entrance to the mine, almost no vehicles ever came through. So most of the time, the job was just incredibly boring. He would just sit there for hours watching the snowfall. But at the same time, it was also a very dangerous post. The Kennecott copper mine was famous. People called it the richest hole on Earth because of the massive amounts of copper, gold, and silver buried in the ground there. And all that valuable material made the mine a huge target for thieves. In just the last few months alone, over $150,000 worth of equipment and precious metals had been stolen. So Brian was always a little on edge out here, all by himself in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the pitch blackness that got to him. It was also the fact that he was totally unarmed. The company didn't provide guards with any weapons. He didn't even have security cameras. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only defense was a telephone on his desk to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been completely normal. It was slow, quiet, and uneventful. So Brian decided to use the downtime to get some studying in. He was in nursing school, and his final exams were just a few days away. He was poring over his notes and textbooks, trying to cram as much information as he could into his head. While he was studying, he took out a thermos. His wife had packed him some soup for dinner. He unscrewed the lid, and just as he was about to take his first spoonful, the phone on his desk started ringing. Brian immediately hesitated. He knew there was a very good chance it was his wife Jennifer on the other end. But things at home right now were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had taken on this night shift at the mine to help pay the bills while he was in nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, money was incredibly tight. And to make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of balancing school, work, and raising a family had been putting a huge strain on their marriage. About a month ago, Brian had hit a breaking point. He'd actually walked out on his family. He left a simple note for Jennifer, saying he just needed some time alone to think things over. Then he drove to the mine, turned in his security badge, and told his boss he was quitting. After that, he just left town. He spent almost a week in Las Vegas, and then he drove all the way out to San Francisco. He was trying to clear his head, but while he was out there, he got a call. His daughter, back home in Utah, was in the emergency room with a bad case of pneumonia. For Brian, that was the wake-up call he needed. He realized he couldn't live with himself if he actually abandoned his family for good. So he immediately got in his car and drove straight back to Utah to be with Jennifer and his daughter. His daughter, thankfully, made a full recovery. And Jennifer, despite him just up and leaving them, she agreed to take him back. But just because he was home didn't mean things went back to normal. There was this constant tension hanging over their relationship. Jennifer hadn't fully forgiven him for what he'd done, and Brian felt like he was walking on eggshells all the time. So now, sitting in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath before picking up the ringing phone. It was Jennifer. He chatted with her for a few minutes, trying to keep the conversation light. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something through the window. It was a flash of headlights, coming up the service road directly towards his guard shack. He told Jennifer he had to go, hung up the phone, and stepped outside to meet the vehicle that was pulling up. About an hour and a half later, around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, a supervisor named Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. He noticed the lights were on inside the shack, but he couldn't see anyone moving around in there. Todd thought this was pretty strange. Brian was under strict orders not to leave his post for any reason. That was the most important rule of the job. You stay put, no matter what. What made it even weirder was that Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. This post was so far away from anything else on the mine property, there was literally nowhere for Brian to go without his car, especially not in the freezing cold. So where was he? Todd was starting to feel a little uneasy. He parked his own vehicle, got out, and walked over to the shack. He opened the door and stepped inside. The tiny space was empty. Brian was gone. But on the desk, Todd saw Brian's hat and his half-eaten thermos of soup. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of his dinner. At this point, Todd knew something was wrong. He picked up the phone inside the shack and called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report a missing person. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving down a dark, snowy desert road heading towards the Kennetock copper mine. Everyone in law enforcement knew this mine was a hotbed for theft. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had vanished in the middle of his shift, Detective Lassig didn't waste any time. The first thought was that this could be related to thieves. Maybe they had kidnapped Brian, or worse. When Lassig pulled up to the main entrance of the mine, he saw another vehicle parked there. It flashed its headlights at him. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved Lassig over. Lassig pulled up alongside him, and the man introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the call about the missing guard. Todd started his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so Lassig did. He followed Todd's taillights deeper into the darkness, down a winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennetock mine was huge, covering 3 square miles of rocky, mountainous terrain. They drove for a solid 10 minutes before Lassig finally saw a single light up ahead. It was the guard shack where Brian had been stationed. The two men parked their cars and got out. Todd pointed to the shack and told Detective Lassig that this was where Brian was supposed to be. Lassig pulled out a flashlight and aimed it at the ground around the shack, but there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any potential footprints or tire tracks were already covered up. So, Lassig stepped inside the shack. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was no blood, nothing was knocked over, no signs of any kind of struggle. But there on the desk was Brian's hat and that half-eaten thermos of soup. It was a strange little detail that just didn't feel right. Lassig was trying to process the scene, running through different theories in his head, looking for any clue about what might have happened. As he was thinking, the phone on the desk rang again. Detective Lassig just picked it up. He answered, and a woman on the other end sounded surprised. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to call her husband Brian. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband had left his post sometime during the night and couldn't be found. He was literally in the middle of investigating his disappearance. He then asked Jennifer when she had last spoken to Brian. Jennifer, obviously shocked by the news, told him she had just talked to him a couple of hours ago. She said they were on the phone and then Brian suddenly had to hang up because he saw a car approaching the shack. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about the car or who might be driving it. But Jennifer said no. He just said a car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was a bit disappointed there wasn't more information, but he thanked Jennifer and promised to be in touch as soon as he knew anything. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the tiny room. But just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. Lassig picked it up. And again, a woman on the line said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer, and she was asking where he was. But as Lassig was listening, he realized something was very wrong. This woman's voice sounded nothing like the woman he had just spoken to a minute ago, who had also claimed to be Jennifer. And this second woman clearly had no idea about their previous conversation. He was talking to two different people, both of them claiming to be Brian Ruff's wife. Obviously, only one of them could be telling the truth. Which meant one of these women had to be lying. A few days later, in mid-December of 1991, Detective Manny Lassig was sitting at the dining room table in the Ruffs' home. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was sitting across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. Brian was still missing, and the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. For the first few days, everyone was kind of hoping that Brian would just show up on his own, that maybe he had run off again like he had before. But as the days turned into a week, that seemed less and less likely. By now, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack that night. He quickly confirmed that one of the calls had come from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number. So, he was pretty sure he was now sitting with the real Jennifer Ruff. But he was still trying to figure out why another woman would call and impersonate her. And the timing of the calls was just too strange to be a coincidence. One right after the other. It was bizarre. So, as Lassig sat across from Jennifer, he started by asking her for her alibi. Where had she been on the night Brian disappeared? She told him she had been at the hospital all night, working a long shift. She even gave Lassig the names of several of her coworkers who could back up her story. Then, Lassig changed the subject completely. He looked her in the eye and asked her point blank if there was any chance her husband could have been having an affair. Were there other women in his life? Had he been acting strange or secretive lately? The reason he asked, of course, was because of that second mysterious phone call. He knew there was another woman out there, even if Jennifer didn't. When Jennifer heard the question, she looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up at him and said, yes, she was suspicious of that. She told Lassig all about the problems they'd been having in their marriage. She told him how, just the month before, Brian had suddenly run off, saying he needed time alone. He was gone for a week with no contact, until he just showed up again, begging her to take him back. When Lassig heard that, he leaned back in his chair. He started to wonder if this whole investigation was a waste of time. If Brian had a history of just taking off without warning, what was to stop him from doing it again? Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. Maybe Brian would just turn up in a few days, just like last time. But Jennifer must have sensed what he was thinking because she quickly added that the first time he left, he had at least left a note. And he'd told his boss he was quitting. There was some kind of warning. She insisted that it was not like Brian to just vanish in the middle of his shift like this, leaving his dinner half-eaten. He had his faults, she said, but this was different. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer if she knew where Brian had gone during that week he was away. In response, Jennifer got up and handed him a piece of mail from a nearby table. It was a credit card bill that had arrived that week, addressed to Brian. She explained she was confused when she saw it because as far as she knew, Brian didn't even have a credit card. But apparently he did, and he had used it a lot while he was gone to pay for hotels, meals, and other things. Lassig took the bill and started looking it over. He saw a lot of charges from Las Vegas and San Francisco, and the amounts for restaurant meals and room service seemed a little high for just one person. He looked up from the bill at Jennifer, and he could tell from the look on her face that they had both come to the same conclusion. When Brian was away that week, he probably hadn't been alone. Jennifer then handed Lassig another piece of paper. It was their phone bill, with a detailed list of every call made and received over the past month. Jennifer said there were a bunch of numbers on the list that she didn't recognize. She thought maybe one of them belonged to the person Brian had been traveling with. As Lassig looked over the list of numbers, one of them immediately jumped out at him. It was the same number that the second woman, the fake Jennifer, had called from on the night Brian disappeared. Later that same day, Lassig was sitting in the living room of the house associated with that phone number. Across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kenotok mine, the same place Brian worked. Dale wasn't home at the moment, and Lassig wanted to talk to Christy alone before he got back. So, he didn't beat around the bush. He told Christy that he was almost certain she and Brian had been having an affair. Before she could even respond, he pulled out the credit card bill Jennifer had given him and showed her the evidence. For a second, Christy looked like she was going to deny it. But then her face crumbled, and she broke down and admitted everything. She said she and Brian had been seeing each other for a while. She confirmed that they had run away together the month before for about a week. And even though they had both come back to their families, she said they were still very much in touch. She said that's why she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared. She was just calling to talk to him. But when a strange man's voice answered the phone, Detective Lassig, she said she panicked. On instinct, she just lied and pretended to be Jennifer, his wife, so that their affair wouldn't be discovered. But she was very clear about one thing. She hadn't heard from Brian since that night, and she had no idea what happened to him. Lassig sat back and just watched her for a moment. She seemed genuinely worried about Brian. And even though her call to the guard shack was incredibly suspicious, her explanation for it actually made a twisted kind of sense. Still, he wasn't about to rule her out as a suspect just yet. And now, her husband Dale was also a primary suspect. If he had found out about his wife's affair with his friend and coworker, he would have a powerful motive for revenge. The next day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Dale Bradley was already sitting there, waiting for him. The moment Lassig came in, Dale asked if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And to Lassig, Dale's concern seemed real. He sat down and asked Dale how long he'd known Brian. Dale said they'd met about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they had become pretty good friends. They even hung out together outside of work sometimes. Then, trying to catch him off guard, Lassig abruptly changed the subject and asked Dale directly about his wife's affair with Brian. Dale looked completely stunned. He said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. Lassig explained what his wife had already confessed to. Dale seemed genuinely devastated. The idea that his wife was cheating on him, especially with a man he considered a close friend, was clearly a huge shock. As Dale was trying to process this, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. Dale, still reeling from the news, took a moment to compose himself. He said that on that night, his car had actually gotten stuck in the snow. He was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which was almost an hour's drive from the mine. He said he even had to call a friend to come and pull his car out of the snowbank, and then he gave Lassig the friend's name so he could verify the story. After writing down the name, Lassig told Dale he wanted him to take a polygraph test. He also said they would need to search his car. Dale agreed to both requests without any hesitation at all. A few weeks later, Lassig was walking across the parking lot at the Kennetock mine. Brian still hadn't been found, and the investigation felt like it was hitting one dead end after another. Dale Bradley and his wife Christy had both taken polygraph tests, and they had both passed. Lassig had also searched Dale's red Mustang, but he found no evidence inside that connected him to Brian's disappearance. On top of that, the friend Dale mentioned had confirmed his story. He said yes, he had gone to help Dale get his Mustang out of the snow that night. So, Dale's alibi seemed solid. At that point, both Dale and Christy were unofficially moved off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the possibility that Jennifer, Brian's actual wife, might have been involved. Her coworkers confirmed she was at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she had hired someone to harm Brian. She certainly had a motive. But with no evidence against her and still no body, all Lassig had was a gut feeling, and that wasn't enough. But then, just a few days ago, Lassig got a new lead that sent the investigation in a completely new direction. That's why he was back at the Kennetock mine to talk to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, again. Lassig went into the office building and found Todd's office. When Todd saw him, he jumped up from his desk and eagerly greeted him, saying he would do anything he could to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told him to sit back down. Then, Lassig sat down, pulled out a tape recorder, and hit the record button. He then told Todd why he was really there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metals and equipment from the mine and selling it all at local pawn shops. An internal investigation had uncovered a whole ring of employees who were involved in the thefts. Todd started to look nervous. He shifted in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he knew that, and that wasn't why he was there. He explained that when he reviewed the records from the theft investigation, he discovered that Brian had been the one who had reported some of his coworkers for stealing. So now, Lassig had a new theory. What if, on the night he disappeared, Brian had stopped a coworker's car, found stolen materials inside, and they had killed him to silence him? Todd leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. Then he admitted that, yeah, that was possible. He then started telling Detective Lassig about several places on the mine's property where a body could be hidden. As an example, he suggested the giant gravel pile by the concentrator, a machine that crushes minerals and grinds them into dust. Todd explained that if Brian's body had been placed there, it would have been sucked into the grinders and pulverized along with the rocks. He would be completely gone. Detective Lassig was taken aback by how specific Todd was being. It was like he had already thought about this in great detail. Sensing something was off, Lassig just let Todd keep talking. And Todd did. He kept offering up one gruesome theory after another about what could have happened to Brian. At one point, he suggested Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen on top of him, burying him completely. He said if that happened, Brian would be under several tons of rock by now, and the police would never, ever find him. On the 10th of July, 1993, a full year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig was driving through a barren stretch of desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of the Kennetock mine. There had been absolutely no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours searching the mine with police dogs and helicopters looking for any sign of Brian. But they had found nothing. Not a single trace. By this point, Lassig was sure that foul play was involved. But it was impossible to prove a murder without a body and without any evidence tying his suspects to the crime. For months, his team had investigated every single security guard at the mine, especially the ones involved in the theft ring. But they had verified that every guard who was on duty that night was at their assigned post when Brian vanished. And they had checked the alibis of everyone who wasn't scheduled to work. They couldn't link a single one of them to Brian's disappearance. That included his supervisor, Todd Fallows, who, despite his strangely specific theories, was eventually linked to the theft ring but had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and her husband Dale, they had been ruled out early on. Their alibis checked out, they passed lie detector tests, and nothing new had come up in the last year and a half to make them suspects again. And Brian's wife, Jennifer, also remained off the list. She had a strong motive, but her alibi of being at work was airtight, and they could find no connection between her and any possible accomplice. So after more than a year of dead ends, the case had gone completely cold. But that morning, the investigation had suddenly come back to life. A group of campers had called the sheriff's department to report finding skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew it was a long shot, but he was hoping it might be Brian. When he arrived at the location the campers had described, he got out of his car and walked across the dry, cracked earth to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow, makeshift grave. The skeleton was still wearing clothes, a dust-covered dark blue jacket. Lassig crouched down to get a better look, and he saw that it was a security guard's uniform. He put on a pair of gloves and carefully searched the pockets of the jacket. His fingers closed around a wallet. He pulled it out, opened it, and found an ID card and credit cards, all with the name Brian Ruff. It seemed clear that this was Brian's body. But because it was so decomposed, they would need to check dental records to be 100% sure, and that would take some time. While the crime scene techs carefully removed the remains, Lassig stayed behind with a K9 unit to search the area for any other evidence. And sure enough, just a few feet away from the grave, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells scattered in the dirt. It looked like Brian had been shot 5 times and then buried. Then, a few yards away from the shells, a police dog started barking. An officer called Lassig over. The officer was holding up a black work boot. There was a clear bullet hole right through the leather. Lassig was sure the boot had to be Brian's. But aside from the body and the boot, 18 months of brutal desert weather, scorching heat, wind, sand, snow, and rain had erased almost every other trace of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig now knew where and how Brian had been killed, he was worried he was no closer to figuring out who had done it. 12 years passed. On the 30th of April, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office received a phone call. Park had been assigned to the cold case unit at the beginning of the year, and his full-time job was to solve old, forgotten crimes. The detective on the phone was from the sheriff's department in the next county over. He was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. Specifically, the murder of Brian Ruff. After the call, Park hung up the phone and went straight to his filing cabinet. He dug through the old dusty files until he found the one for Brian Ruff. He sat down at his desk and began sorting through the stacks of decade-old papers. And as he read, he noticed a tiny piece of evidence that the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized this small detail was the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on all the forensic evidence, this is what police now believe happened to Brian Ruff on the night of the 10th of December, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down that dark, winding service road toward the isolated part of the Kennetock mine. Up ahead, they saw the single light from Brian's small guard shack. The killer pulled their car right up to the shack and parked. When they got out, Brian came out of the shack to see who it was. He waved hello. The killer waved back and walked towards Brian. And as soon as they were close enough, they grabbed Brian, spun him around, and tied his hands behind his back. Before Brian could even react, the killer forced him into the back of their vehicle. The killer then got into the driver's seat, made a U-turn, and sped away from the mine, heading out towards the desert. As they drove, Brian was screaming and kicking in the back, trying desperately to escape. But the killer remained calm and just kept driving for nearly an hour until they reached another remote spot deep in the desert, about 50 miles away from the mine. They pulled off the road and stopped in an open, snow-covered patch of land. The killer got out, opened the back door, and dragged Brian out of the car. Brian was still fighting, but he was exhausted. He started pleading for his life, promising that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone what had happened. But the killer wasn't listening. They grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then, at gunpoint, forced him to dig his own grave in the frozen ground. When Brian was finished, the killer raised the shotgun and shot him 5 times. After Brian was dead, they pushed his body into the hole he had just dug. The killer then got back into their car, a red Mustang, but when they tried to drive away, the Mustang's tires spun in the snow. They were stuck. So, they had to make a phone call to a friend for help. The friend came out, having no idea that a murder had just been committed only a few feet away, and helped the killer get their car out of the snow. And then, the killer drove off into the night. The killer was Dale Bradley, the coworker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that his car had gotten stuck in the snow an hour away from the mine was true. But it wasn't an alibi. It was a confession. He was describing being stuck at the crime scene. The friend who came to help him was telling the truth when he confirmed the story to the police, but he had no idea he was helping a murderer flee the scene of the crime. The police never cross-referenced the location where Dale said he was stuck with the location where Brian's body was eventually found. And so, they mistakenly believed his story. Additionally, Dale had passed a polygraph test early in the investigation, which made him seem even less like a suspect. He and Christie eventually divorced, likely because of the affair, and Dale later remarried. But in 2005, when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered, the detective investigating her case noticed that Dale Bradley had now been close to 2 different people who had been murdered. He thought it was too much of a coincidence, so he called Detective Park, the cold case investigator. That phone call prompted Detective Park to take a fresh look at the entire Brian Ruff case file. And that's when he found the note about the tiny speck of red paint found on the sole of the black work boot that was discovered near Brian's body. Park had the paint speck reanalyzed, and he was able to match it perfectly to the paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale Bradley's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Ruff's murder on the 19th of September 2005. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for his second wife, Crystal, her murder case remains unsolved to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the early 1990s, a young woman in her 20s named Krista Froder was managing a retail store called the Boston Store in Madison, Wisconsin. She was dedicated and professional, and she had a real knack for the job. Not long after she started there, the store hired another employee. His name was Bart Halderson. Like Krista, he was in his early 20s, though he was about 3 years younger than her. He was brought on as a clerk. Now, Bart and Krista didn't know each other before they started working together, but their shifts often lined up, and as time went on, they naturally started talking and getting to know one another. It didn't take long for them to realize they had a surprising amount in common. They had both grown up in the general area just outside of Madison. They had even graduated from the same college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they discovered a shared passion for home design. Krista, who had majored in art history, was particularly passionate about the interior side of things, how a space could feel, the colors, the furniture, the whole atmosphere. Bart, on the other hand, was just one of those people who seemed to be born with a natural talent for fixing things. With just his bare hands and a few tools, he could figure out almost any problem. Growing up, his favorite projects were always related to home repairs. It didn't matter if it was something small and simple or a huge, complex undertaking. He just found this deep sense of satisfaction in keeping a home in perfect working condition. And so, surrounded by the daily routines of retail, Bart and Krista bonded over these shared interests and their similar background. Their casual work friendship slowly blossomed into something more, a genuine romance. By 1994, they had both moved on from the Boston store. They had gotten married and moved into their first apartment together in DeForest, Wisconsin, which wasn't too far from Madison. Life was starting for them, and everything felt full of promise. 2 years later, in 1996, Bart and Krista welcomed their first child, a little boy they named Mitchell. The moment Mitchell was born, Krista knew she wanted to stay home with him to be there for every little moment. Bart was completely supportive of her decision. He went out and secured a great job as an accountant, a position that paid well enough to support their growing family. Just 18 months after Mitchell arrived, they welcomed their second and final child, another boy whom they named Chandler. Their family felt complete. A few years after Chandler was born, Bart and Krista had diligently saved up enough money to finally buy a house of their own. The house they chose was a modest, small, two-story home in a very quiet, peaceful little town in Wisconsin called Windsor. Windsor was close to DeForest where they had been renting, but this little house was different. It was theirs. It was perfect for Bart, Krista, and their two young boys. It wasn't just about having enough space for the family to grow. Because it was their own home, Krista could finally unleash her passion for interior design. She carefully planned the layout of every room, and she took immense pride in keeping the house perfectly tidy and beautiful at all times. For Bart, this house was a canvas. He immediately dove into one home repair project after another. This house became his trophy, a symbol of everything he had worked for, and he was determined to keep that trophy polished and pristine. But it wasn't just the physical house that made it feel like their forever home. It was the community. As soon as they moved in, Bart and Krista made friends with all of their neighbors. The people on their street were incredibly friendly and welcoming. Before long, the Haldersons were deeply involved in community activities. They volunteered with the Boy Scouts and the Kiwanis Club. They donated their time and money to other local charities. It was clear, very quickly, that the Halderson family had found the place where they truly belonged. And so, for the next 2 decades, life for the Haldersons in that little home in Windsor was, by all accounts, perfect. Bart continued to climb the ladder at his accounting firm, providing a stable and comfortable life for his family. Krista remained a devoted mother and a meticulous housekeeper, creating a warm and loving home. As for their sons, Mitchell and Chandler, they were given every opportunity their parents could possibly afford them. They grew up in a loving, supportive environment, and both of them seemed to thrive. By 2021, the picture of the Halderson family was one of complete success. The older brother, Mitchell, who was now 25, had moved out and was living on his own in an apartment. He had graduated from college and landed an incredible IT job with a very successful local company. He was engaged to be married and was on the verge of buying his own house. He was following right in his parents' footsteps, building a solid and happy life for himself. As for the younger brother, Chandler, who was 23 at the time, he was still living at home with Bart and Krista, but he seemed to be doing just as well as his older brother. He was in his final year of college, on the cusp of graduation. He had already accepted a full-time, high-prestige job with SpaceX, which was set to start in Florida as soon as he had his degree. While finishing up his last year of school, he told his parents he was working part-time at a local insurance company to help pay them rent. He also said he was volunteering his remaining spare time with the Madison Police Department on their elite rescue scuba diving team. Chandler was also in a committed relationship with his girlfriend. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for Bart, Krista, Mitchell, and Chandler. But their lives were about to take a sudden and devastating turn for the worst. It all began in June of 2021. That month, Chandler, who was supposedly just weeks away from flying out to Titusville, Florida, to begin his dream job with SpaceX, had a terrible accident. He said he fell down an entire flight of stairs, smashing his head in the process. He told his family he immediately picked himself up and tried to convince himself that he was okay, just a bit shaken. But over the course of that day, he started to feel woozy and disoriented. He said his legs started to feel numb, and in a panic, he rushed himself to the hospital. Unfortunately, when doctors scanned his brain and checked him over, they supposedly discovered he had a severe concussion from the fall. They told him he had a brain bleed that would almost certainly require surgery at some point in the future. And the numbness in his legs, they said, appeared to be the result of permanent nerve damage. And so, just like that, Chandler, who had been so excited about this incredible opportunity in Florida, was suddenly back home, confined to the house, wearing a neck brace and using a cane to get around. Even with the cane, he could barely walk. To make matters even worse, he almost immediately lost the job at SpaceX. He told his family that because he couldn't travel to Florida to start on time, they had to fill the position with someone else. Chandler did his best to stay positive and optimistic in front of his family, but this was a crushing blow. Everything he had seemingly worked so hard for had just been snatched away. It was crushing for his family, too. Seeing their beloved Chaz, as they called him, lying on the couch all day, looking totally miserable and depressed, was awful. But as terrible as Chandler's accident was, the trauma it inflicted on him and his family was nothing compared to what was about to happen next. The Haldersons owned a small cabin in a part of Wisconsin called White Lake. It was located about a 3-hour drive north of their home in Windsor. The cabin was nestled inside a rural forested area right near a large lake, also called White Lake. This cabin had been in the Halderson family since the 1940s. When Mitchell and Chandler were little kids, Bart and Krista would take them up there all the time. They'd go fishing, swimming, or just relax by the water. It was their family vacation spot. But at some point, as the boys got older, they weren't as interested in going to the cabin anymore. As a result, Bart and Krista basically stopped going up there. However, just 2 weeks after Chandler's horrific injury, a huge storm rolled through the White Lake area. After the storm passed, Bart and Krista received a phone call. Some people who lived permanently in White Lake called them and said, "Hey, I was driving past your cabin and I saw there were some broken windows. It looks like your cabin might have been damaged by the storm." And so, Bart and Krista started to worry. They thought, oh my goodness, we have to get up there as soon as we can to patch up that window and check for any other damage before another storm rolls through and completely ruins the place. So, Bart and Krista pulled out their calendar. They saw that the next weekend was the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July is a very big holiday in America, a celebration of independence. In White Lake, they celebrate it with a big parade down Main Street and a spectacular fireworks display out over the lake. Bart and Krista figured, you know what, let's just hold off for a couple of days and time our trip with the holiday weekend. We can make the necessary repairs and also enjoy the festivities, turn it into a little mini vacation. And so, that was the plan. But right before they were supposed to leave for this trip up to White Lake, Bart and Krista started acting a little strange. On the evening of Thursday, July 1st, the day before they were scheduled to leave, they began packing their things. Since Chandler was living with them and couldn't go anywhere due to his injury, he was at home and saw them getting ready. At one point, he got up and hobbled over, trying to help them pack, but it was short-lived because his legs were just too weak. So he sat back down and just watched them. And what he saw was odd. They were packing lots and lots of cash and several silver bars into their luggage. Chandler thought this was strange, but he decided not to say anything. He figured, you know what, maybe they want to stash their valuables in the cabin for safekeeping. It's their business, not mine. So Bart and Krista continued to pack, and Chandler continued to watch. At some point, he asked his parents, "So how are you getting up to White Lake?" His parents just said, "Oh, we're getting a ride from our friends, another couple. They're driving us up." But they didn't tell him who the couple was. They were vague, just saying, "our friends." Again, Chandler is sitting there thinking, okay, this whole thing is a little bit weird, but he told himself, it's their business. I'm not going to press them about it. They obviously don't want to tell me. So he just let it go. At some point, Bart and Krista finished packing. They moved all their luggage to the front of the house, right near the front door. A little while later, they and Chandler all went to their separate rooms and went to sleep. The next morning, Friday, July 2nd, Chandler got up early, around 6 in the morning. When he woke up, he began slowly hobbling his way down the stairs. He expected to see his mom and dad in the kitchen, having breakfast and getting ready to leave. They certainly wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. But when he got downstairs, the house was dark and completely empty. All of the bags that his parents had packed the night before and placed by the front door were gone. Chandler thought, did my parents get up at 5 in the morning and leave without telling me? He went to the front door and looked out the window, thinking maybe they were just waiting outside. But when he looked out, his parents weren't there. And sure enough, both of their cars were still parked in the driveway. So Chandler was left to conclude that, well, I guess my parents did get picked up by whoever these mystery friends were, and they just didn't feel the need to wake me up and tell me they were leaving. This did leave Chandler feeling a little shaken. He kept thinking about the strangeness of what they were packing, the fact that he didn't know who they were with, and now this sudden, quiet departure. But again, Chandler just told himself that his parents would be fine. These were just a few random, weird things, but they didn't necessarily mean there was a problem. So Chandler managed to push his concerns out of his mind and went about his day. Since his parents were now going to be gone for the weekend, he promptly called his girlfriend, Catherine, and asked her to come over and stay with him for a couple of days. She came over, and because Chandler couldn't really do anything because of his injury, they basically spent the weekend lounging around, eating nice food, and watching Netflix. But by the end of the weekend, on Sunday morning, there was an unspoken feeling that something was wrong. Chandler had told Catherine about the strange circumstances of his parents' departure, but he had assured her, I'm sure it's fine, and she had agreed, saying of course his parents were fine. But by Sunday, Bart and Krista still hadn't called or texted. They hadn't checked in with Chandler or Mitchell or anyone. They were just completely silent. And whenever Chandler or Catherine tried calling Bart or Krista's cell phones, the calls didn't even ring. They went straight to voicemail. But late that day, on Sunday, July 4th, just as real concern was starting to mount, a text message came through to Chandler's phone. It was from his mom, Krista. The message basically said, hey, we arrived in White Lake. You know, it's packed here, the service is terrible, but we're going to stick around for the parade, and we'll be back either Monday night or early Tuesday. As soon as Chandler and Catherine saw this text, it was like a huge weight was lifted. All their worries seemed to vanish, and they were just excited to see Bart and Krista when they came back the next day or the day after. But the next day, Monday, Bart and Krista did not come home. They didn't call anyone, they didn't text anyone. And again, whenever anyone tried calling their cell phones, which now included Mitchell, who had been looped into the situation, the calls went straight to voicemail. Then, the day after that, on Tuesday, July 6th, the day Krista had said they would be home by, they still didn't come home. And again, no one could get in touch with them, and they hadn't contacted anyone. Additionally, on that Tuesday, Krista's office began calling Chandler and Mitchell. They were asking if the boys knew where their mother was. Krista had recently taken a customer service job at an auto body shop, and apparently she was scheduled to work on that Tuesday. She was also scheduled to work the previous Friday, the day she and Bart had left for the lake. This meant she had left on this trip without telling anyone at work. According to her boss, Krista was the kind of person who would call or text ahead, even if she was just running a couple of minutes late. For her to be a complete no-show without a word was totally out of character. But before Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine could even process this new worrying information, Bart's employer started calling them, asking the same questions. Hey, do you know where Bart is? He's supposed to be working right now, and we can't get in touch with him. He didn't put in for any time off. So all afternoon on Tuesday the 6th, Chandler, Mitchell, Catherine, and other family members were frantically trying to call Bart and Krista. They were calling other people they knew in White Lake to see if anyone had seen them, but nobody had. And so finally, the next morning on Wednesday, July 7th, when there was still no word from Bart and Krista, Chandler went to the police and filed a missing persons report. Almost immediately, the police in Windsor contacted the police up north in White Lake. They asked them to do a welfare check on the Halderson cabin to see if maybe Bart and Krista were there and just had terrible service, or if maybe there had been some kind of accident. But when the White Lake police arrived at the cabin, Bart and Krista were not there. No one was. In fact, the cabin looked like it hadn't been used in months. The outside was totally overgrown with weeds, and inside there was no food in the fridge. And most interestingly, the police told Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine that there was no damage to the cabin. There were no broken windows, no obvious signs of any storm damage at all. After this revelation, of course, the family's minds started racing. Wait a minute. Who called them and told them to go up there to fix broken windows that weren't even broken? Were those the same mystery friends who drove them up in the first place? What was going on? Was this some sort of trap? Had they been set up? Were they okay? By the following day, Thursday, July 8th, there was still no sign of Bart or Krista, and the police didn't have any new leads to speak of. Chandler was desperate. He went to the local media and pleaded with them. Please run a story about my parents. Get the word out that they're missing. Maybe someone knows something and will come forward. And the local media did just that. While this media coverage was going on, Chandler went back to his home and, with his cane, hobbled door to door, asking each of his neighbors if they had a security camera on the front of their house. He was hoping a camera might have captured an angle of the street and might have seen his parents on the morning of July 2nd when they supposedly climbed into that mystery couple's car. Chandler hoped that if he could get that footage, someone might be able to identify who these mystery friends were. But unfortunately, none of his neighbors had the right footage. As it would turn out, though, it didn't matter. Because on that same day, the 8th, the police made a discovery. At first, it seemed relatively small, a minor detail. But when they examined it more closely, they realized it was a huge breakthrough, one that would completely break the case wide open. To understand this breakthrough, we have to go back to the 29th of June, 2021. This was 3 days before Bart and Krista supposedly hopped into that mystery car and headed up to White Lake. On that day, June 29th, Bart had finally had enough. There was something that had been bothering him for a very long time, and he had finally decided that today was the day he was going to get to the bottom of it. So Bart pulled out his phone, he punched in a number, and he put it to his ear. After a few rings, a young man named Omar Job answered the call. In total, Bart and Omar would speak on the phone for 17 minutes. For the first half of the call, it was basically just Bart being angry and aggressive towards Omar. But during the second half of the call, when Omar finally had a chance to speak, Bart's tone completely changed. He was no longer angry. He actually sounded totally defeated. After this 17-minute phone call finally came to an end, Bart was left in a state of shock. But he knew what he had to do next. He needed to set up an even more intense meeting with a group of people, and he needed to tell them what he had just learned from Omar. Within 24 hours, Bart had arranged this additional high-stakes meeting. It was scheduled for 3 p.m. on July 1st. July 1st was the day before Bart and Krista would supposedly leave for White Lake. And so on July 1st, the day of this pivotal meeting, Bart was working from home. At some point, he looked at his watch and saw it was just after 2 p.m. Even though the meeting was still an hour away, the location was a bit of a drive, and he knew he needed to leave soon. So Bart stopped working, and he sent a text message to Chandler, who was in the house with him. The text just said, "Ready to leave when you are." Chandler was fully aware of how important this meeting was for his dad. He also understood the terrible position his dad was in. And so he had agreed to go with his dad to this meeting. After a couple of minutes, both Chandler and Bart had gotten dressed and were ready. They met downstairs on the first floor. After a quiet nod to each other, they began walking towards the front door. But then, something happened. Chandler was standing just behind Bart. As they moved towards the door, Chandler reached out and grabbed a rifle that he had hidden on the first floor. He raised it, and he fired at least 2 shots into his father's back. And then, once his father fell to the ground, either dead or dying, Chandler, as calm as can be, pulled out his own phone. He texted his mother and told her, "Hey, Dad's phone is dead, so just text me." Then, Chandler sent his mother another text, a chillingly normal one. "Get soda on your way home." His mother simply replied, "Kay, I can," smiley face. All Chandler was trying to do was buy himself as much time as possible to prepare the house for his mother's return. Over the next couple of hours, we don't know exactly what Chandler did, but it's assumed he moved his father's body into a hiding place. And then, after maybe trying to clean up a little bit, Chandler laid in wait for his mother. At 4:58 p.m., Krista clocked out of her job at the automotive shop. She made a quick stop at a store to buy Chandler some soda. And then, between 5:15 and 5:30, security cameras on neighbors' houses captured her car pulling into her driveway. A couple of minutes later, she walked inside of her beautiful little dream home, the home where she had raised her family for the past 2 decades, only to be immediately gunned down by her own son the second she walked through the door. It would turn out Chandler was living a complete double life. He had never graduated from college. He had attended college, but only for about a semester, and he had flunked out. But he just kept telling his friends and his family that he was progressing through his classes and that he had eventually graduated. It was all a lie. He also did not have a job at the insurance company. He just told his family that he worked from home, which really meant he sat in his room and played video games all day. He was not a rescue scuba diver for the Madison Police Department. For one, he wasn't a scuba diver. And 2, the Madison Police Department did not have a rescue scuba diving team. And, needless to say, he did not have a job with SpaceX. He had never even applied. As for his head injury, he may have bumped his head at some point, and he did go to the doctors by himself sometime in mid-June. But that doctor just told him he might have a mild concussion and offered him a neck brace, telling him he didn't even need to wear it unless he wanted to. But Chandler very quickly turned this non-injury into a debilitating, crippling, life-altering condition. He literally hobbled around everywhere with a neck brace and a cane, and the reason he did that was because he needed an excuse. He needed a reason for why he wasn't starting his non-existent job at SpaceX. In short, Chandler lied about virtually every aspect of his life to virtually everyone he knew. And for the most part, people believed him. However, his parents were becoming more and more suspicious, especially in 2021. He was telling them, "Oh yeah, I'm working at the insurance company," but he never had any money. He could barely pay them rent if he paid at all. And so his dad, Bart, would ask him, "How is it that you're employed but you have no money?" The way Chandler handled this was elaborate. He would create fake email accounts, pretending to be people in human resources at the insurance company. Then, acting as them, he would write these convoluted emails with ridiculous excuses for why Chandler hadn't been paid yet. He would have that fake email account email his real account. Then, from his actual email, Chandler would write back, acting angry and stern, saying, "You have to fix this. My family's not happy." Then he would once again pretend to be the HR person and reply, "I'm so sorry. It's some internal issue. We're going to fix it, but you just have to wait." Chandler would take these fake exchanges and forward them to his father. And while Bart didn't necessarily believe what he was seeing, it was enough to get him to stop asking questions, at least for a little while. But Bart and Krista were also suspicious of other parts of Chandler's life, like his school records. At some point, he needed to show them his transcripts. He would tell them, "Oh, I can't access my transcripts," and Bart and Krista were like, "Why can't you? Just log in and pull up your unofficial transcripts." The way Chandler handled this was the same way he handled the insurance company lie. He created fictitious email accounts of people who were supposedly college advisors at Madison College, where he claimed to have graduated from. He would conduct these phony back-and-forth email chains where it looked like the college was telling Chandler, sorry, you can't get your transcripts. It's this huge problem that's totally our fault, not yours. But you just have to wait. There's nothing we can do right now. When Chandler would forward these exchanges to Bart, Bart would get totally worked up about it. Finally, he demanded that Chandler give him a phone number so he could talk to one of these college advisors himself. So Chandler went out and bought a burner phone from a convenience store. He gave that phone number to his dad. And when his dad called the number, somebody picked up, introducing themselves as Daniel Spieth. But it was really just Chandler disguising his voice. And this Daniel Spieth gave Bart the same spiel about how sorry he was and how it was all the college's fault that they couldn't get his son's transcripts and he was just going to have to wait. And so finally, on the 29th of June, 2021, Barney had enough. He was convinced his son was lying. There was just too much about his son's life that didn't add up. So Bart decided he was just going to call Madison College himself, pretend to be Chandler, and see if he could get the transcripts. And so he dialed the number for customer service at Madison College. And after a few rings, Omar Job, a customer service representative, picked up. Initially, Bart was aggressive and mean towards Omar for no real reason other than his immense frustration with the whole situation. He's on the call pretending to be Chandler, and he's barking at Omar, "Give me my transcripts right now. I go to your school. There's no reason you can keep them from me." But after a couple of minutes, Omar was finally able to get a word in. He said, "Hey Chandler, I looked you up in the system, and you don't go to this school. You've never gone to this school except for maybe one semester, and you failed out." It's at this point, when Bart hears these words, that he just pauses for a really long time on the call. Then he begins asking follow-up questions that aren't really connected to getting transcripts anymore, because now he knows the transcripts don't exist. He begins asking Omar, "Does Daniel Spieth still work there?" Omar looks him up and says, "No, there's no Daniel Spieth that works here. And there's no Daniel Spieth that's ever worked here." Because Chandler had used 5 or 6 different fake names when pretending to be college advisors, Bart, in addition to asking about Daniel Spieth, asked about every other name he had interacted with. And one by one, Omar told him, "I'm sorry, those people do not work here. I've never heard of these people. They're not in our directory. I'm sorry." At the end of that 17-minute call, Bart knew. His son was living a monumental lie. So he hung up with Omar, and then Bart called the real college advisors at Madison College. He set a meeting for July 1st at 3 in the afternoon. And then he told Chandler that he had set this meeting and that Chandler was going to come with him, and together they were going to ask those advisors why they couldn't produce Chandler's transcripts. Bart, of course, knew Chandler didn't have transcripts. So he likely set this meeting up as an ultimatum, a way to force Chandler to finally call the meeting off and come clean about this huge lie, so that Bart could help his son get back on the right track, stop lying, and start living a real life. But the way Chandler handled being caught was not to own up to any of it. He didn't call off the meeting. He just waited until the day of the meeting, and then he killed his father, killed his mother, and then dismembered their bodies. He burned their body parts in the family fireplace, including their heads. And when he couldn't completely destroy their bodies that way, he took what was left of their remains and scattered them all over town, in parks, in forests, in rivers. He even put his father's headless, armless, legless torso behind his girlfriend's parents' house. And all the while he's doing this, he's spinning this ridiculous story to his girlfriend, to his brother, to other members of the Halderson family, to the police, to his parents' colleagues. He tells them Bart and Krista just up and left on the morning of July 2nd with this mystery couple. And oh, by the way, my parents were packing cash and silver bars in their luggage. So, I don't know, they went up to White Lake and now they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. We don't know why Chandler chose this specific story. It's unclear if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were suspicious and had gotten into something that got them harmed or kidnapped, or if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were just gullible and had been taken advantage of. We don't know. He was just trying to make the whole situation seem plausibly suspicious. Ultimately, though, Chandler did so many things that got him caught. From the mountain of physical evidence he left behind inside of the house where he killed and dismembered his parents, and also at the various dump sites where he didn't even bother to bury the body parts. He would just put them underneath some sticks and branches, so they were very easy to find. To his extremely suspicious behavior on July 7th when he walked into the police station to report his parents missing. That whole time he was talking to police officers, he was acting so weird and saying things that just didn't make sense. He came off like a guy who did not care at all that his parents were gone and who was clearly hiding something. But the big breakthrough that happened on July 8th, the one that broke the case open, stemmed from that text message that Krista's phone sent to Chandler's phone on July 4th. When Chandler walked into the police station on July 7th and said his parents were missing, one of the first questions they had for him was, "Okay, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents?" Chandler told them he got a text message from his mother on Sunday, July 4th. He showed them the message. It said they had arrived in White Lake and they were going to be sticking around for the parade and they'd be back in a couple of days. But the police noticed a critical flaw. The text message had been sent on July 4th. But in White Lake that year, the big 4th of July parade was on July 3rd. So when this text came through, the parade that anyone in White Lake would have been aware of, it's a small place, you wouldn't miss it, had already happened. So why would Krista be texting her son that she was going to stick around for a parade that was already over? This led police to check phone records. And they would discover that yes, that text message was sent from Krista's phone to Chandler's phone, but when it was sent on July 4th, Krista's phone was not in White Lake. Instead, it was inside the Halderson home right near Chandler's phone. When police went to the Halderson house, they searched it. They found Krista's phone in the garage, underneath a drawer, inside of a shoe, wrapped in tinfoil, right next to her driver's license. Chandler had obviously sent that text message himself using his mother's phone. But he had gotten the date of the parade wrong. This one discrepancy opened up the floodgate. Before long, it was beyond obvious that Chandler was the killer. And after a thorough investigation, it was determined that Chandler had acted entirely alone. His girlfriend, Catherine, and his brother Mitchell had nothing to do with it. They were just innocent bystanders caught in his web of deceit. Chandler would ultimately be found guilty of killing his parents. He would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Chandler has still not taken any responsibility for what he's done. Instead, he just tells anyone who will listen that his plan is to continue to appeal his verdict, clinging to his lies until the very end. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in rural Ohio. He suddenly heard his bedroom door creak open. Now, he was used to this sound. He figured it was just his great-grandparents, the people he lived with, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. And so, he's a little kid. He just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. But he could hear the distinct sound of footsteps making their way across his bedroom. He heard the old floorboards groaning under someone's weight. And then the footsteps stopped right next to his bed. The silence was heavy. Curious, the little boy couldn't help himself. He slowly, carefully opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, and what he saw standing over him was not his great-grandparents. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, A 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet two-lane road in Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was the kind of place where towns were small and separated by vast stretches of farmland. It was peaceful, predictable. As Linda drove, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the empty fields. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband, Jack, owned in a nearby town. It was a place they had built together, a source of pride for them both. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This path led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. It was their sanctuary, a place far removed from the noise of the world. She parked her car outside their old, charming farmhouse. Before getting out, she reached into the back seat and grabbed a vinyl deposit bag. It was heavy with the cash and checks from the day's sales at the pizza shop. She stepped out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside washed over her. The farm was so isolated that she couldn't hear any passing cars or the distant sounds of neighbors. The only noises were the gentle bleating of their sheep in a nearby pasture and the familiar intermittent buzz of power tools coming from the barn. Jack was working on something again. She walked around to the back of the barn, and sure enough, there he was. Jack was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, his hands covered in grease. He and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, it felt different. It felt right. She truly believed he was her soulmate. Jack was a man who couldn't sit still. In addition to co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also worked a full-time job at a local manufacturing plant. And on top of all that, he had a side business restoring classic cars. It was his passion. So it was no surprise to Linda to find him out here, tinkering with an engine as the sun went down. Sitting in the grass right beside the car, playing with a heavy wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda approaching, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, scrambled to his feet, and ran over to her, wrapping his small arms around her legs in a big hug. Seeing Damien's smile always made Linda feel a mix of joy and a little bit of sadness. It was a bittersweet feeling. Damien was the son of Linda's granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had become pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and in no position to raise a baby. So Linda and Jack, without a second thought, had offered to take Damien in. They said they would raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. Of course, the situation wasn't perfect. There were complications. One of the biggest problems was Damien's biological father. He was furious about the custody agreement. He felt he had been completely cut out of his son's life. Even now, 4 years later, he would still argue with Linda. He would accuse her of keeping him from his son. But Linda had her reasons. She had seen too many young fathers make promises and then disappear. She was terrified that he would come into Damien's life only to abandon him later. She couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of heartbreak. So she stood firm. She didn't want him around Damien at all. Besides, Damien would have another father figure in his life soon enough. In the last couple of years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. They were building a life together. And their plan was that as soon as Damien finished his current year of preschool, in just a couple of months, they were going to take him in and raise him on their own. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber. She had watched her granddaughter grow from a scared teenager into a responsible young woman. But at the same time, the thought of Damien leaving brought a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss him terribly. They loved him with all their hearts. In every way that mattered, he was their son. Linda could see that Jack was deep in concentration, focused entirely on the car's engine. She knew he didn't like to be interrupted when he was in the zone. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him over to the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set the little boy down on the floor, and told him to go wash his hands and get ready for dinner. Then, Linda walked into the kitchen. She went into the adjoining dining room and casually dropped the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto one of the chairs. The bag was full of that day's cash. Her plan was simple. She would take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda pulled out a pan and started cooking dinner. It wasn't long before her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms streaked with car grease. He walked over to the kitchen sink to wash up. While the water ran, Linda came up behind him and started asking him about his day. Jack just grumbled in response. He was clearly agitated about something. He started complaining about a customer he'd sold a car to the previous year. The man had bought it on a payment plan, but had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the man's house the next day and repossess the car. It was a hassle he didn't need. Linda could see how tense Jack was. His shoulders were tight, his voice was strained, but she knew it wasn't really about the missed car payment. That was just a small annoyance. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week, ever since he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid. He was incredibly close with his dad. In fact, Greg had been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding 7 years ago. But recently, Greg's life had started to unravel. He was going through a messy divorce. He was struggling with drinking and drug abuse. He'd been missing shifts at his job. Things were not going well for him. And so, earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm. He had asked Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on and he needed help. But Jack had decided to practice tough love. He had drawn a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act, stop the substance abuse, and get back to work. He wasn't just going to hand him money to enable his bad habits. This, of course, had led to a massive fight between them. Words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. And now, Linda had a strong feeling that Jack was genuinely worried. He was afraid that he had done real, permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was scared that their relationship might be broken beyond repair. And this fear was rooted in past experience. Something very similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis. About 7 years earlier, when Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into a terrible argument. It was so bad that Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda was sure that Jack was now terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. He couldn't bear the thought of losing both of his sons. So, while Jack stood at the sink washing the grease from his hands, Linda gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders, deep down. He was just going through a rough patch and needed a little nudge to get back on track. That's all Jack had done. He had given him that nudge. She reassured him, telling him he had made the right call. She said Greg would get through this and would come to understand his father's decisions sooner or later. After that, Linda set the table and she called the family to dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock on the wall. She realized it was getting late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and grumpy. She scooped the little boy up and carried him to his room upstairs to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas. She helped him brush his teeth. Then she tucked him into his bed, gave him a kiss goodnight, and quietly closed his bedroom door. Linda went back downstairs, and before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. Soon, Linda was in their bedroom on the first floor. She had turned on a small lamp on her nightstand. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. And within minutes, they both fell asleep. But several hours later, in the dead of night, Linda was violently woken up by a horribly loud noise. It was a deafening crack that echoed through the silent farmhouse. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, disoriented. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw a figure in the room. and she gasped. The next morning, at a church just a mile down the road from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children began to arrive, she noticed there was an empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't entirely unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents led very busy lives. They owned a business, Jack had another job, they ran a farm. She just figured they were running a bit behind schedule that morning. So she started the class, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day's activities. About an hour later, at 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled. He was out of breath, his face was pale. He wasn't carrying his little backpack. And he was still wearing his pajamas. And then she saw it. There was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his pajama shirt. She quickly ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized with a jolt that the brown spot was dried blood. The teacher asked Damien what was going on, where his great-grandparents were. He looked up at her with a scared, confused expression on his little face, and he told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker, along with his partner, was driving his cruiser down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darke County Sheriff's Department for 5 years. He was the head of the investigative unit. So, when the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to investigate. The call had been routed from the preschool teacher. She had explained that a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, out of breath, and saying something very strange about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher identified the great-grandparents as Linda and Jack Myers and gave the police their address. Now, Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could possibly mean by melting faces. He didn't know what kind of situation he and his partner were about to walk into when they arrived at the farm. But he had a gut feeling that it was not going to be good. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel road. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. It was a profound silence. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields stretching in every direction. Whitaker started walking towards the front door of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already standing wide open. He scanned the doorframe and the lock. There were no clear signs of a forced entry, no splintered wood or pry marks. But nonetheless, seeing an open door at a potential crime scene set off alarms. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully across the threshold and into the house. Whitaker began calling out, announcing their presence, asking if anybody was home, but his voice was met with only silence. There was no response. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door inside the house. This one led to a set of stairs that went down, presumably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now. Standard procedure was to clear the main living areas first. So, he and his partner continued clearing the first floor. They moved cautiously into the kitchen. Once they were sure it was empty, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. And when Whitaker stepped inside that bedroom, he found Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers. They were lying in their bed, side by side. And he could tell immediately from the amount of blood and the stillness of their bodies that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could see a large, devastating bullet wound on the back of his neck. As for Linda, she was lying on her back. She had multiple gunshot wounds, one to her face and another to her hand. It looked as if she had raised her hand in a desperate, final attempt to defend herself before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house, upstairs and down, just to make sure the shooter was no longer there. The house was empty. The two officers returned to the bedroom to begin the grim task of investigating the bodies and the immediate scene. Whitaker put on a pair of latex gloves. He gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on this, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for shell casings. He didn't see any. This was significant. It meant the killer had taken the time to go through the trouble of picking them up afterward. They were trying to cover their tracks to remove evidence. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. It was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. He saw that it was a piece of thick quilting fabric that had been wadded up and was covered in layers of masking tape. It was a crude, homemade object. His best guess, based on his experience, was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had likely taped it to the end of their gun barrel to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. And it must have been blown off at some point when they actually started shooting. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were so far out in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbor was a good distance away. But then, Whitaker left the bedroom and went up the flight of stairs to the second floor. He went into the room that was located directly above where the murders had taken place. He opened the door and found a child's bedroom. It was full of stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And it was at that moment that Whitaker had a chilling realization. The killer must have known there was going to be a toddler sleeping right upstairs when they committed this crime. They needed the silencer not to hide the sound from the neighbors, but to avoid waking the child in the house. This detail shifted everything. It meant that the killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This was not a random act of violence. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office began to arrive, swarming the property. Whitaker went outside to supervise the expanding scene. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over to look at something they had found. It was a set of clear footprints in the soft mud next to the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints. They led around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane itself had been carefully pried off and was lying on the ground, leaving an open hole that was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the open space. He could see that inside there was a set of stairs leading up to the main part of the house. He realized this must have been how the killer got inside. And it also explained why, when they had first entered the house, they had seen the door to the basement standing wide open. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that this crime had to have been committed by somebody close to the couple. The killer knew the layout of the house. They knew about the basement window. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, they could figure out the exact type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The telephone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wires were cleanly severed. The killer had clearly planned this attack ahead of time. They had made sure that nobody inside this house would be able to call for help. Just then, a truck pulled up at the end of the long driveway. A woman got out and started walking cautiously toward the house. Whitaker quickly went over to intercept her to stop her from getting too close to the active crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars coming down the road and didn't know what was going on, but she felt she had some information that they might find useful. The neighbor said that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the vehicle, but it had stuck out in her mind because, as far as she knew, the Myers did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized that this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. And if that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially crucial piece of the timeline. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, he went back inside the house to look for more clues. He was trying to piece together a motive. He felt strongly that whoever had done this knew Linda and Jack. But that didn't automatically explain why. There could be any number of reasons for the attack. Maybe it was a robbery that went wrong. Maybe it was an act of personal revenge. He just didn't know. But as he began walking through the house again, he found that deposit bag full of cash sitting in plain sight in the dining room. This was a major discovery. It strongly suggested that this was not a robbery. A thief would certainly have taken a bag full of cash. He also noted that there were some fairly expensive electronics in the living room, a television and a stereo system, that also had not been touched. So, the robbery theory seemed to be off the table. But when Whitaker went back upstairs to take a closer look at the toddler's bedroom, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small little red stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While the forensics teams were still meticulously combing over the farmhouse, another investigator who had been assigned to the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, went to the local preschool. His goal was to speak to 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of empathy and connection to this little boy who at this point looked terrified and completely bewildered by everything that was happening. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic. But Damien was the only potential witness. He was in the house when his great-grandparents were killed. Speaking to him was the police's best chance at figuring out what had happened. So, Burns sat down on the floor with Damien inside a quiet, private room at the school. He spoke in a soft, gentle voice. He asked him to explain what had happened that morning. Damien, speaking in the simple, direct way that a 4-year-old does, said he had woken up around 8:45 in the morning. The house had been very, very quiet. So, he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said that both of them were in the bed. At first, he thought they were just sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then he realized there was blood on their faces. He said he had tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes he found, but there was so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He thought for a second that their faces were melting. And so, in a panic, thinking he had to save his great-grandparents, he had run the full mile all the way down the road to his preschool to get help. Burns was amazed that this 4-year-old child could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. But he was also very grateful. The child's story explained why there was blood on Damien's pajama shirt. However, it did not explain the other mystery, why they had also found that small spot of blood on Damien's own bed. So Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he had gone straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt there had to be more to the story. Otherwise, he just couldn't explain how a drop of blood wound up in Damien's room. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small figures. He asked Damien to act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien picked up the toy that represented himself and put it into the bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the figures for Jack and Linda into the bed in the other room. He said everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtimes. But then he said that later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just letting his imagination run wild, or maybe describing a nightmare he'd had. But then, Damien set the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his own fingers. He made his fingers crawl like a spider across the floor of the dollhouse, moving toward Damien's bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open. He had opened his eyes just a tiny little bit, but he didn't want to let on that he was fully awake. So he was just squinting his eyes. And he said when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed. And the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien was so terrified, he said he slammed his eyes shut and just pretended to be fast asleep. And then, he said when he opened his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's recollection was almost certainly not a dream. It was too specific, too real. More likely than not, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, 19-year-old Amber Holscher. The detective drove out to Amber's house, which was in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered it right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders. So, Amber seemed to have no idea why a detective would be standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this was going to be difficult, so he gently said to her that he needed to come inside and speak with her. Confused, Amber agreed and let him in. They sat down together in her living room. Then Burns, as gently as he could, told her that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. But when Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. Where had they gone? So Burns took a deep breath, and he clarified. He told her that they were deceased. The word hung in the air. Amber looked completely shocked. Her face went white. The first words out of her mouth were, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. No, he said. He's alive. He's safe. But he explained that Damien was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were concerned that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to come back and hurt him too. And until they had narrowed down the suspects, Damien would not be allowed to see anybody in the family, and that included her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and began to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his mind was racing. He was thinking about Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as humanly possible. Every day that went by unsolved would be another day that this little boy would have to spend alone in the system without any family to comfort him after what he'd been through. Based on Amber's genuine shock and immediate concern for her son, and the fact that Damien had not mentioned seeing his mother on the night of the murder, Burns thought it was highly unlikely that Amber was a suspect, but she might know something that could help the investigation. So, once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. And right away, she nodded. The first person she mentioned was Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. She told the detective that, in fact, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and started a huge fight with her right there in public about custody. The argument had escalated to the point where Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This obviously caught Burns's attention in a big way. It was a clear and direct threat. It also made perfect sense as a motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier path to getting custody of Damien. So he thanked Amber for her time and promised he would be in touch with any updates. As soon as he was back in his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him everything he had just learned. Later that same day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they arrived, Andrew quickly came to the door and let them inside. They all sat down, and Andrew looked at them, clearly wondering what was going on. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered. And they watched Andrew's face very carefully for his reaction. He seemed very surprised by the news, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew then freely admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family at all. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in the heat of the moment, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do it. He said it was just an empty threat, something he said out of anger and frustration. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew looked very suspicious. His demeanor was off. So he asked him for an alibi. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house on the night of the murder. And in the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house for a bit and then had gone straight to his job. He said they could ask all of those people and they would all confirm where he was. Whitaker wrote all of this information down. He asked Andrew a few more questions and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's apartment, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They went to the woman's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And then they also went to his place of work. And to their disappointment, everybody at all three locations confirmed Andrew's story. They all backed up his alibi. So, unless all of them were lying for him, it left no window of time where Andrew could have possibly driven 2 hours away to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven 2 hours back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like it wasn't going to go anywhere. And all the while, he was thinking about that little boy, Damien, who was all alone, waiting for them to find the person who had turned his world upside down. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother Amber, was sitting inside his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, the 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was looking like that was going to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, a number of sheriff's deputies had fanned out and interviewed Linda and Jack's family members and friends. And several family members in particular had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had dug into the files on Travis, he found out that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It appeared that Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually didn't know where Travis was at all. And there was no other current address on record for Travis. So, Burns basically had no idea where he was. He began to wonder how he was going to track this man down. He decided the best place to start would be by visiting Travis's younger brother, Jack's other son, whose name was Greg. Burns knew from the case file that Greg lived only a few towns over. And even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, especially after so many years, it was the only lead he really had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man wearing a baseball cap answered. He looked exhausted, and his eyes were red and swollen, as if he'd been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg did not seem remotely surprised to see a detective at his door. He said the police had already contacted him the night before to tell him about the murder of his father and stepmother. And ever since that phone call, he said he'd just been sitting at home waiting for somebody to come by and talk to him. He'd seen enough TV crime shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But when they got into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. And Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here just hoping to get a clue about where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Up until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg would go on to tell him that Travis had actually been back in Ohio for the past several weeks. He was staying in an apartment that he had rented right nearby. Burns immediately thought the timing seemed incredibly suspicious. It just seemed way too convenient that Travis had decided to come back into town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just felt too perfect. And also, at this point, it just seemed really strange that these two brothers were just standing there together, as if they were waiting for the police to come and question them. Something about the whole scene just felt off. So Burns, operating on a gut instinct, told them both that in order to question them properly, they would actually need to come with him down to the station and do it formally there. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns opened the door of the Darke County Sheriff's Office and showed Greg and Travis Myers inside. Now, neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, But Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or even both of them could be. Burns took Greg into his own office for questioning, while Burns's partner took Travis into a separate interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down in the chair in front of the desk, Burns noticed that he wasn't making eye contact with him. He was shifting in his seat, acting shifty. But pretty quickly, Greg said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. And so Burns immediately began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was and what he was doing in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that for the most part, he was just at home, asleep. That is, until about 4:30 in the morning, when he got up to go to his job at a factory that was a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the whole night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card back at his house that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. He remembered that the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 on the morning of the murders, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, as Burns thought about it more, he started to realize that even if Greg's alibi were a little shaky or didn't check out perfectly, the timing alone likely ruled him out as the primary suspect. It seemed basically impossible for him to drive from his house at 4:30 in the morning, when he said he left, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in at 5:23 in the morning, the time stamped on his card. There just wasn't enough time to do all of that. And also, pretty much everyone in the family had told the detectives that Greg was quite close with his father Jack and his stepmother Linda. Now, he was having some serious problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no prior history of crime or violence. None of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg remained a person of interest, Burns decided he would shift the main focus of his investigation to the other brother, Travis. So Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about Jack and Linda's murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but that he'd mostly just been concerned about how Greg himself was coping because Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Travis was estranged. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken a single word to each other, and that those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about the details of that falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. So, Travis had just quit the business, packed his bags, and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if so, that would definitely be a solid motive for murder. And so Burns made 2 mental notes for himself. One was to follow up and verify Greg's alibi, just in case. And the other was to look into Jack's will to see how his assets were going to be divided up between his 2 sons. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left the room. He went right down the hall, and he waited outside the door while his partner finished questioning Travis. Burns's partner would later say that Travis had seemed really nervous from the very moment he stepped inside the interview room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio after all these years. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently, and he'd realized that he'd never actually met his brother Greg's children, his own nieces and nephews. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing on the night that Jack and Linda were killed. And Travis stuttered out that he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked him if he had anybody who could confirm that alibi. Travis kind of hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car, a white minivan. After getting debriefed by his partner about this interview with Travis, Burns went back into his own office. By this point, Greg had been moved out and put in a different waiting room. Burns sat down at his desk, and he began going over the evidence they had collected so far. Now, the investigation up to this point had been moving really quickly, and so there actually wasn't a whole lot of hard evidence yet. In fact, it had only been about 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for the results on pretty much everything, from the fingerprints to the ballistics. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited for more evidence was go and follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. After all, they were the victims' children, and he already had a strong feeling that the killer had to be someone connected personally to the victims. And they both drove minivans. So really, either one of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's phone rang. He picked it up, and it was a local man. The man said he had seen a news report on TV about Jack and Linda's murders, and he had some information that he thought just might help. The man said that a few days earlier, his friend had called him to see if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man, who was talking to Burns, had asked his friend why he needed the gun, the friend had said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this. And as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who his murderer was. Based on this crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence that would soon come back from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of March 27, 2003. Early on the morning of the murders, the killer woke up and got out of bed. The first thing they did was put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with several items, a roll of duct tape, a box of trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun that they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, turned on the car, and then drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of Dark County. They were calm at first, focused on the task ahead. But as they turned onto the gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned all of this out meticulously. They had prepared for anything that could go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked the minivan right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still inside the vehicle, they climbed into the back seat and grabbed their shotgun. They took the thick piece of quilting fabric and wrapped it tightly around the barrel of the shotgun, using the masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they went through these planned motions, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous, because as much as they had planned for this, it really was not something they actually wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. They felt backed into a corner. So after their gun had its crude silencer attached, they slung it over their shoulder. Then they got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they used a tool to cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside would be able to call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt and mud, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. And there they were, sleeping in their beds. The killer took a deep, shuddering breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was so powerful that it blasted the homemade silencer right off the end of the barrel. It wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The wadded-up fabric and tape landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. And almost immediately, from the chaos and the noise, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer, and she saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. And in a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand, and the other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and waited, listening. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the second two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise could have easily woken up the third person who they knew was in this house. a person they really did not want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure they didn't leave any loose ends, they left Linda and Jack's bedroom, confident that they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside. They carefully walked over to the side of the boy's bed. They raised their shotgun and aimed it at this child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and quietly walked out of the room. Once they were back out in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and then hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and they sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and the green jumpsuit into a river. And then they changed into their work clothes. They drove to the factory where they would clock in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they were fighting about it. But Greg knew that he would stand to inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, so deep in his problems, that he decided murder was his best and only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23, just as he claimed. Greg was ultimately arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The arrest happened so quickly that police were actually still gathering the evidence they would use against him. They later recovered the gun, the other supplies, and the shoes that matched the prints found outside the house from a river right near the farm. Fingerprints on the items and receipts for their purchase tied them all back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he would go to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now a young man and is doing very well. Cases like this remind us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not hiding in the woods or under the bed, they're already inside the family. If you enjoyed today's story, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more strange, dark, and mysterious true crime stories, there's an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time.